The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as I walked deeper into the forest, my boots crunching on the gravel path beneath me. I had never been to this part of the woods before. A small cabin stood nestled between towering trees, its wooden frame barely visible through the thick undergrowth. The year was 2023, and at 27 years old, I was far from inexperienced when it came to outdoor adventures. I had grown up camping and hiking, spending countless nights in tents and under the stars. But this cabin, perched on a remote hillside, seemed different. Something about it tugged at the back of my mind, though I couldn't place it. The plan was simple. I needed a weekend to escape, a weekend away from the constant noise of my daily life. Work, city traffic, social obligations, all of it. When I stumbled upon this cabin on an old camping website, I figured it would be perfect. A cozy little retreat in the middle of nowhere, far from any distractions. The owner had listed it as a rustic escape, something out of the ordinary, but the reviews were good, and I was all for a bit of quiet solitude. The cabin came into view as I rounded a bend in the path. It was smaller than I had expected, but charming. The wooden walls were weathered, the roof slanted steeply down to the sides, and the chimney poked out like a crooked finger against the gray sky. There were no other buildings in sight, no sign of other people for miles, just the deep forest surrounding it. I stepped up onto the porch, the wooden planks creaking under my weight, and turned the rusty doorknob. The cabin smelled of pine, old wood, and dust. It was as though it had been waiting for someone to come. A small wooden table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the room, a faded rug beneath it. The kitchen was to the right, with a cast iron stove and an old-fashioned sink. There was a tiny wood-burning stove in the corner, with a stack of firewood next to it. The furnishings were simple, nothing extravagant, but it felt homey in a way. I set my backpack down on one of the chairs and made my way to the window. From here, the view was spectacular. The forest stretched out for miles, and beyond that, jagged mountains rose, their peaks shrouded in mist. It was perfect, the kind of place I had been craving. I felt a sense of peace wash over me, the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders. I set about unpacking, organizing my things, making sure everything was in its place. I planned to stay here for 2 nights. I didn't intend to do much, just read, relax, and maybe do a little bit of hiking around the area. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned orange, I decided to take a walk around the cabin. The forest felt alive with the sounds of evening creatures, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, the occasional snap of a twig. But there was something else, a distant noise. It was faint at first, almost inaudible, but it was there. A low thudding sound, like something heavy hitting the ground. I stopped in my tracks, listening intently. The sound came again, and this time it was closer. I shook it off as a deer or some other forest animal, but the feeling of unease lingered. I had been in forests like this before, but never one so isolated. It was unsettling, in a way I couldn't fully explain. The cabin felt so distant from everything, like it was forgotten by the world, tucked away in the farthest reaches of the woods. I decided it was best to head back inside, where it felt safer. The moment I stepped back onto the porch, I heard the noise again, a sharp thud, then silence. It was coming from the woods, somewhere off to the left, just beyond the trees. I couldn't see anything, but I didn't want to go investigating, not when the forest was so thick and the darkness was creeping in. Inside the cabin, I stoked the fire, the warmth from the crackling logs filling the room. I made a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the night settle in. The silence outside seemed to grow deeper, and that's when I noticed it. The wind had stopped. No rustling leaves, no creaking branches, just a stillness that felt almost unnatural. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. That night, I slept fitfully. The bed was comfortable enough, but every creak of the house, every snap of wood in the fire, kept me awake. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate steps that moved around the cabin. My heart raced, but when I peeked out the window, I saw nothing but darkness and the outline of trees. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I woke early and made breakfast, determined to enjoy my time here. I headed out for a hike up the nearby hill, eager to explore the area. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, the trees tall and imposing, their trunks covered in moss. The sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled light on the ground. I tried to focus on the beauty of it all, but the sense of being watched lingered, just at the edge of my awareness. It wasn't until I reached the top of the hill that I found it. An old, rusted hunting stand, its metal frame half hidden by overgrown vines and branches. I approached cautiously, peering up through the gaps in the trees. It looked ancient, as if no one had used it in years. The wood was rotting, the metal oxidized. But what caught my eye was something unexpected. A small pile of what appeared to be animal bones scattered near the base of the stand. I crouched down to examine them. The bones were bleached white, old and brittle, as though they had been there for a long time. There was no sign of any recent animal remains, just these bones, lying in the dirt. A chill ran down my spine. Why would someone leave bones here, in the middle of the woods, far from any other human presence? My mind began to race, but I forced myself to leave the hunting stand behind and head back to the cabin. The afternoon passed without incident, and I began to feel a sense of calm returning to my body. I made dinner, read for a while, and then went to bed. But once again, sleep eluded me. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence of the cabin. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, and I thought I heard something scratching at the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. It was just after midnight when I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening. The noise came from outside, a heavy thud against the cabin wall. I grabbed the flashlight from the table beside the bed and crept toward the window. I could see nothing in the darkness beyond the glass, but I heard it again. Thud, thud, thud. My pulse raced. I had no idea what it was, but it was definitely coming from the direction of the woods, just beyond the porch. For a moment, I considered packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to overreact. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. Maybe a bear or something large hitting the cabin out of curiosity. But there was an instinct inside me telling me to stay quiet, to stay still. I sat up, listening. The thudding continued for what felt like an eternity, then suddenly stopped. Complete silence returned, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But that wasn't the end of it. A new sound filled the air, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching over the gravel path. They stopped at the porch, and I held my breath, my hands trembling. Whoever or whatever was out there was close now. I could hear them shifting, moving, and then a soft knocking sound on the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I was paralyzed with fear. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The porch was quiet again, and the air felt thick with tension. I waited for what seemed like hours, but nothing happened. I had no idea if whoever had been out there was still around. I couldn't even bring myself to check the door. The thought of opening it and finding something out there in the dark made my blood run cold. By morning, I was exhausted. My nerves were frayed, my sleep disturbed by the events of the night. I knew I couldn't stay any longer, not after what had happened. I packed my things quickly, making sure I didn't forget anything. As I walked out the door and down the porch steps, I glanced at the woods one last time. The silence was back, but it was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It felt ominous, like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't look back as I left the cabin behind, walking quickly down the path that would take me back to my car. The drive home felt longer than it had any right to be, the road stretching out in front of me as if I were being pulled away from something I couldn't fully understand. As I turned the corner and the cabin disappeared from view, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly escaped something. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I'd never go back there. And for the first time in a long while, I was glad to be home. I wasn't the kind of person who usually went out to the woods alone. My friends often joked about my nervousness when it came to being in the middle of nowhere, but after weeks of pressure from them, I finally agreed to spend a weekend alone in a cabin in the woods. It seemed harmless enough, a quiet break away from work, a little peace and solitude. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, off the grid, just the way the owners liked it. It sounded like an escape, and at first, that's all I wanted. I had just turned 29. I had a decent job, a few friends, and a lot of stress that needed to be shaken off. It was late October, just before the snow would start to fall, and the chill in the air had already begun. My car pulled into the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, its tires crunching over the dry, brittle leaves. Trees lined both sides of the road, their trunks dark and twisted, reaching up into the sky like skeletal hands. A cold wind rustled through the branches, sending a shiver down my spine. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, feeling a little uneasy, but that was normal, right? I'd rented the cabin through a small, local agency. The ad had been vague, only offering the basics: a small, one-bedroom cabin with a fireplace, a view of a nearby lake, and no other houses for miles. No neighbors, no distractions, just peace. The perfect retreat. As I parked and grabbed my bags from the back of the car, I noticed how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that seems almost unnatural. The kind that makes you realize how much noise is around you all the time, even when you're not paying attention. There were no birds chirping, no sounds of traffic, just an almost suffocating silence. I locked the car, grabbed the key from under the mat, and made my way to the front door of the cabin. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the wood cold under my hand. Inside, the place was exactly as I'd expected, rustic but comfortable. A large stone fireplace sat in the center of the living room, with a small couch and a few wooden chairs scattered around. The wooden floors creaked beneath my feet, and the scent of pine and old wood filled the air. The windows overlooked a small, mist-covered lake, the surface of the water smooth and glassy, reflecting the gray sky above. A chill seemed to settle in the room as I took a deep breath. This place was going to be great, I thought, just what I needed. I unpacked my bags and started a fire in the hearth. The flames flickered and crackled as I sat down in the armchair, settling in for a night of reading and relaxation. The hours passed slowly, and by the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, the only light in the cabin came from the fire and a single dim lamp near the door. Outside, the wind had picked up, and I could hear the branches scratching against the walls of the cabin, making the house feel even more isolated. Around midnight, I heard a noise, a faint scraping sound, like something dragging along the ground. It wasn't a loud noise, just a soft, unsettling sound, but it was enough to make me pause. I sat up straight, listening carefully. The fire popped and crackled in the hearth, the only other sound in the room. I waited, holding my breath, but there was nothing else. Maybe it was just the wind, I thought, or maybe an animal outside. I shrugged it off and went back to my book, but the uneasy feeling lingered. An hour later, I heard it again. This time it was louder, closer, like something was definitely moving outside. The sound was slow, deliberate, like footsteps dragging through the leaves. I stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The mist had thickened, and the lake was barely visible now, shrouded in fog. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with the weight of the wind. I didn't see anything moving, but the sense of being watched crept up my spine. I backed away from the window and walked over to the door. It was locked, the deadbolt securely in place. I could feel my pulse quickening as the silence settled in again. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or some other animal had wandered too close to the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to check the windows again, but this time, I heard a loud thud. Came from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat. The thud was heavy, like something large had bumped into the side of the house. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and moved cautiously toward the back door. I shined the light through the window, scanning the dark yard behind the cabin. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, just outside the pool of light from the cabin. It was hard to make out, just a shadowy shape against the trees, but there was no mistaking the feeling of being watched. My mind raced. Was it a person? A man? I had to be imagining it, right? Maybe it was just a trick of the light or the trees playing games with my eyes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing. I had come here to get away from everything, but now all I wanted was to leave. I grabbed my coat and ran for the door, but as I reached for the handle, a loud bang echoed from the back of the cabin. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone had just hit the wall. I froze. What the hell was going on? I turned, my eyes scanning the room for anything I could use as a weapon. The fireplace poker. I grabbed it and held it tight, my hand shaking. There was no way I was going outside to confront whoever or whatever was out there. The banging came again, louder this time, and I could feel the walls of the cabin shaking from the force of it. It sounded like someone was trying to break in. I moved back to the window and looked out, but there was no one there. The figure had disappeared, but the noise continued. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. The hours dragged on, but the banging didn't stop. Came in waves, each one more frantic than the last. I was trapped, my only thought now being how to survive the night. I wasn't sure if I could even make it until morning. When I was about 15 years old, my family took a week-long camping trip to Larchwood State Park, a thick, quiet stretch of forest in northern Wisconsin. It was late summer, early August 2008, and the kind of hot that lingered even after sunset. The campground was one we visited every year, not because it was fancy or had lots of amenities, but because my dad liked how spaced out the campsites were. No crowds, just trees and dirt and quiet. My friend Ethan came along with us that year. We'd been friends since we were little kids. Every summer, we'd find a way to hang out as much as possible. And for a couple years running, my parents let me bring him along on our family camping trips. He fit in fine with our crew, mostly kept to himself during the day, played cards with my younger brother, and helped my dad carry water or split kindling. But the best part of those trips was what we called the ritual. Every night after dinner, once my siblings were tucked into their sleeping bags and my parents were sitting by the fire with mugs of tea or beer, Ethan and I would take off into the woods with flashlights. We never really told anyone what we were doing. It wasn't bad. We weren't sneaking off to smoke or do anything like that. We just liked the dark, the quiet, the kind of thrill you get when you're 15 and testing your nerves for no good reason. The trail behind our campsite led out to a network of paths, mostly old logging roads that had grown over. They weren't marked, not officially, and most campers didn't go beyond the main loop trails during the day, let alone at night. But we did. We got used to the layout of the land. Each night, we'd go a little farther, timing ourselves, seeing how deep into the woods we could go before our guts told us to turn around. We had cheap LED flashlights, but part of our game was trying to walk without them. You'd be amazed how much you can see when your eyes adjust. We called it navigating the dark. The trick was to wait 5 or 10 minutes after leaving the lit campground, then turn the flashlights off and give your eyes time to adjust. If the moon was out or even just the stars, you could make out enough to keep going. Barely. That night, the one I still think about sometimes, we decided to break our own record. We wanted to get past the little creek that marked what we'd always treated as the unofficial end of our trail. Beyond that was just more woods, and neither of us had ever gone further. So after dinner, maybe around 9:30 or so, we took off like usual. It was a Tuesday night, and the campground was half empty. Our site was on the outer loop, which meant the woods were thicker around us and we had fewer neighbors. We didn't say much as we walked. That was part of it too. Keeping quiet. Just our footsteps on the dirt, the crunch of leaves and pine needles under our boots. A raccoon rustled in the underbrush maybe 10 minutes in, and both of us jumped a little, but we laughed it off. Normal wood stuff. The air was heavy, muggy even, and the mosquitoes were worse than usual. We had bug spray on, but they still hovered around our ears, those high-pitched whines that you can't unhear once they start. About 20 minutes in, we reached the creek. We both paused at the edge, and Ethan gave me a quick nod before stepping over it. Crossing it felt like crossing some invisible line. On the far side, everything seemed darker, quieter. The air was cooler too, or maybe that was just in my head. The forest was denser here. Trees stood closer together, and the underbrush was thicker. We didn't have a set destination, we just kept going. Flashlights off, eyes straining in the darkness. That's when we first heard it. A whisper, soft, quick, like a word spoken too close to your ear but too quiet to make out. We both stopped walking. I flicked on my flashlight and turned around. So did Ethan. The white beams scanned the woods behind us. Trees, leaves, the dirt path. Nothing else. No footsteps, no shapes, no eyes glowing in the beam. Just forest. We looked at each other for a second, both of us with that same expression that says, "Did you hear that too?" We kept walking. The second time we heard it, the whisper was longer. Like a sentence, but broken up, nonsense words, or maybe words we just couldn't quite understand. And it was closer. This time, we didn't move. I slowly turned on my flashlight again and swept it behind us. Still nothing. Not even the sound of twigs breaking or leaves rustling. Ethan whispered, "We should head back." And I agreed. It didn't feel like a joke anymore. We turned around, this time with the flashlights on, and started walking fast. Not quite running, but close. Every 30 seconds or so, one of us would glance behind. I could feel my heart beating harder than it should have. I wasn't scared yet, not really, but I had that crawling sense in my spine that said something was off. Then we saw her. I caught the movement first. Just outside the edge of my flashlight beam, something shifted on the ground. I stopped, pointed my light toward it, and there she was, a woman on all fours, crawling slowly through the leaves and dirt. Her hands and knees were filthy, her clothes dark and caked with mud. She wasn't wearing a jacket, just a dark t-shirt and jeans. Her hair was long, tangled, and full of leaves and twigs. At first, I thought maybe she was injured, but she was whispering, loud enough now that we could hear some of the words. They didn't make sense. Just random things. Blanket for keys. I told them not to. It was fast, broken, like her mouth couldn't keep up with her thoughts. She didn't look at us. Not at first. Then she did. When she saw us, she froze for a second. Her mouth stopped moving. Then she stood up slowly, unsteady on her feet, and looked straight at us. Not angry, not happy, just blank. Her eyes didn't track right. Her face didn't move the way you'd expect someone's face to move when they're looking at people in the dark woods. She said something about her campsite, said she was trying to find it. That was enough for me. We told her to follow us, and we started walking back toward the campground. She stumbled after us. She wasn't talking as much now, just muttering every few steps, like her brain was stuck in a loop. She didn't ask who we were, didn't seem to care. We crossed back over the creek, and I felt a little safer once we did, like we were back in the part of the woods we knew. Took us about 15 minutes to get back to the edge of the campground. We passed a couple bathrooms, a few parked cars. The woman followed behind us, still walking weird, like her knees didn't bend all the way. Once we reached the first loop of campsites, the lights from the bathhouse gave us some real visibility. I got a better look at her. She was maybe in her late 20s, face streaked with dirt, eyes glassy, lips cracked, definitely out of it. Her jeans were torn at the knees, and her t-shirt was soaked with sweat. We asked if she remembered her site number. She didn't. We figured we'd just walk the loops and look for anyone who recognized her. We must have walked by a dozen sites before we got lucky. A guy sitting by a fire pit glanced up as we passed, did a double take and stood up fast. A couple other people came over, and one of them recognized her. Turns out she'd wandered off hours earlier. Her friends thought she'd gone to the bathroom or passed out in one of the tents. She'd been drinking heavily, maybe something else too, and must have gotten turned around on the way back. No one had realized she was missing. They hadn't even looked for her. I didn't say anything to them, just nodded when one of them said thanks and turned to leave with Ethan. We walked back to our site in silence. The next morning, I told my dad what had happened. He didn't say much, just shook his head and told us not to wander that far out again. I agreed. Ethan and I didn't do the ritual again for the rest of that trip. We never saw the woman again, not even in passing. Years later, when I think back on it, the part that sticks with me isn't her crawling or the whispering. It's the way she looked at us when we first spotted her. That blank, unblinking expression, like she wasn't all there. Like something in her brain had short-circuited and she was just running on autopilot. If we hadn't gone that deep into the woods, I don't think anyone would have found her until morning. Or later. It was creepy, yeah, but also just sad and real. A good reminder that the scariest things aren't always monsters or shadows. Sometimes it's people. Lost, broken, forgotten people hidden in the dark, where nobody's looking. That was the last summer I ever went that far into the woods at night. I still camp, I still hike, but I keep my flashlight on, and I stay on the trail. I didn't plan the trip for anything special. I just needed a break. Everything back home had started to feel like noise. My job was the kind that crept into your head even when you weren't at your desk. And I had this constant twitchy need to check my phone. Like if I didn't reply to an email fast enough, the world might fall apart. So I picked a week in October, when the air would be cool but not freezing yet, and drove 5 hours north into Vermont. The plan was simple. Stay 3 nights in the forest near Groton, off one of those smaller trail loops that break away from the bigger campsites. I found it months ago on a hiking blog. The author said that if you walked 1.5 miles past the last designated fire ring, there was a little clearing next to a shallow stream, and barely anyone went that far in. That sounded perfect to me. I got to the trailhead around noon on a Wednesday. The lot was empty except for a white Subaru with a dusty back windshield. I took my pack from the trunk, locked my car, and started walking. It had rained earlier in the week, so the path was damp but not muddy. The leaves were turning all kinds of red and orange, and every now and then, one would flutter down in front of me like it wanted me to notice how pretty it was before it hit the dirt. I passed 2 fire rings along the trail, but kept going until the path started to narrow and the trees grew tighter around me. A fallen log marked the side trail I was looking for, just like the blog said. I turned off and followed a faint footpath down toward the stream. There was no one around, no tire tracks, no voices in the distance, just the sounds of water running somewhere ahead and the crunch of leaves under my boots. The clearing was still there. It had a dip in the middle where the ground was packed down, like others had set up tents before. I dropped my pack and stood still for a while. The air smelled like pine and wet bark. A squirrel ran across a low branch to my right, and birds hopped between trees. It was peaceful in that way you can only get when you're far enough from other people that the air itself feels different. I spent the rest of the afternoon setting up camp. My tent went in the dip in the clearing, and I gathered a circle of stones for a small fire pit. I'd brought enough water to last the 3 days, but I still walked down to the stream just to look at it. It was about 2 feet wide and shallow enough that I could see the smooth pebbles on the bottom. The water ran clear, and the bank on the other side was thick with undergrowth and ferns. That night, I lit a small fire and ate one of those vacuum-packed pasta meals I heated over the flame. The stars came out one by one, and I watched them for a long time. I could still hear the stream trickling below, and every now and then, a rustle from the trees when something small moved in the underbrush. Nothing unusual, just the normal sounds of the woods. I didn't fall asleep right away. It always took me a while on the first night of camping. I kept thinking I heard something just beyond the edge of the clearing, but I reminded myself it was probably just deer or raccoons. It wasn't like there were any predators around here. Sometime after midnight, I finally drifted off. When I woke up, it was from a dream I couldn't remember, but I was sweating despite the cold. I unzipped my sleeping bag a little and turned over, trying to go back to sleep, but then I heard it. Not the rustling again, not the breeze. It was the sound of something heavy snapping a branch. I lay still. I didn't move. I strained to listen. I know animals make noise in the woods all the time, but this didn't sound like a rabbit or a fox. It sounded slow and deliberate, like whatever it was didn't care how much noise it made. The sound moved around the perimeter of the clearing, behind my tent. A crunch of leaves, then another, then nothing. I stayed awake until dawn. When the sky finally started to lighten, I crawled out of the tent, heart still thudding. There were no tracks. Nothing looked disturbed. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, or maybe I dreamed the whole thing. I shook it off and went about my morning. I made coffee on my camp stove and sat by the stream. But the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt tense, like the woods were holding their breath. That day, I hiked a loop trail about 3 miles long that circled the ridge near the clearing. I brought a day pack with snacks and a map, and I kept to the trail. It helped to walk. I didn't feel as nervous when I was moving. The forest was empty the whole way. I didn't see another person. No signs of anyone else. When I got back to camp, I checked everything. My tent was untouched. My food bag, which I'd tied up in a tree, was still there. But I kept noticing little things. A rock near my fire pit looked moved. My folding chair had shifted a bit, like maybe it had been knocked or brushed past. They were small details, and I told myself they didn't mean anything. That night, I skipped the fire. I ate inside the tent, trying not to make noise. I kept my flashlight close and didn't unzip the flap. The forest outside felt alive in a different way now. Every creak or crack made me jump. Then, sometime after midnight again, I heard it. A sound like breathing. It wasn't loud. It was faint, almost like wind moving through a tunnel. But it was rhythmic. Inhale, pause, exhale. I held my own breath to make sure it wasn't just me. The sound was right outside the tent. Then I heard another snap. Closer this time. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I had a bear spray canister in my hand, but my fingers were shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could use it right. I lay there, eyes wide, staring into the dark. And then, like the night before, silence. No footsteps, no breathing, just nothing. When the sun came up, I burst out of the tent. Again, no tracks, no signs. I walked in a wide circle around the clearing, checking for anything out of place. Nothing, but I knew what I heard. That was my second night. I still had one left. I didn't want to pack up early. I told myself if I left now, I'd never come back to the woods again. That fear would win. So I stayed. I forced myself to stay. During the day, I built up the fire pit and added extra wood. I made sure I had my knife, my bear spray, and a metal tent stake within reach. I checked my phone, even though I hadn't had signal since I left the car. Still nothing. Before the sun went down, I walked the perimeter again. About 50 yards from camp, I found something I hadn't seen before. A patch of ground where the leaves had been brushed away. Not a full path, but a spot where it looked like something or someone had stood. A spot with clearer soil and a long scuff mark. I stared at it for a long time. Then I walked back to camp. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat upright inside the tent, flashlight off, just listening. The forest outside was quiet. Too quiet. Not even birds. No insects. Just this thick, heavy silence. Then, sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard the crunch of leaves again. It was coming straight toward me. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't trying to sneak. The steps were slow, deliberate, moving through the undergrowth toward my tent. I clenched the bear spray in one hand and kept my other hand near the zipper of the tent flap. The steps stopped a few feet away. I could hear breathing again. Soft, steady. Then nothing. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. Still nothing. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped out slowly. That's when I saw the footprint. It was in the soft dirt by the edge of the clearing. A boot print. Definitely not mine. It was larger than mine and the tread was different. I scanned the woods in every direction. Nothing moved. I packed up as fast as I could. Tent, stove, food bag, everything jammed into my pack. I didn't even eat. I hiked out without stopping. I didn't look back. I didn't take photos. I just kept moving until I reached the car. The white Subaru was gone. I threw my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and drove until I hit the nearest gas station with a signal. I never reported it. I didn't know what I would have said. There wasn't a crime. There was no proof. Just footprints, sounds, and a feeling I can't explain. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I haven't gone camping alone since. The air was crisp as I pulled up to the cabin, the engine of my car growling to a stop as I turned it off. I had been driving for hours, far from any town, surrounded by nothing but trees and the distant echo of birds. The place felt isolated in a way that made me uneasy, but that was the idea. I had rented this cabin to get away from everything. The stress of work had been wearing me down, and I needed time to recharge. The more remote, the better. But now that I was here, a sense of quiet seemed to settle over me, almost too still. I grabbed my bag from the back of the car, my boots crunching the leaves underfoot as I made my way toward the small, weathered building. It wasn't much, just a simple one-story cabin. The wood on the outside worn and chipped from years of exposure. It had a rustic charm to it, or so I thought, but something about the place felt off. The door creaked as I opened it, and I stepped inside, the scent of pine wood and dust filling my nostrils. The interior was basic, with a small living room that had a couch and a fireplace. The kitchen was just a corner space, and a narrow hallway led to a couple of rooms, probably bedrooms. The place seemed fine at first glance, but there was something about it that set me on edge. The first few hours passed quietly. I unpacked my things, started a fire in the fireplace, and made myself something to eat. The cabin didn't have Wi-Fi or cell service, so I couldn't distract myself with my phone. Instead, I decided to take a walk around the property. The cabin sat on a plot of land surrounded by thick woods. The trees stretched high above me, their branches swaying in the breeze. The forest looked alive, but it also felt a little too quiet, almost like the woods were holding their breath. I walked along a trail that led behind the cabin, hoping to find something interesting. The trail twisted through the trees, and I noticed something strange as I walked. There were no animal sounds, no rustling of leaves from small creatures. Everything seemed unnaturally silent. I paused for a moment, looking around, but all I saw was the vastness of the forest. I shrugged it off, telling myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. After about an hour, I returned to the cabin, feeling the unease in my chest slowly growing. I made myself a drink and sat by the fire, the flames crackling in the silence. I was about to turn in for the night when I heard it, a faint sound, like a tapping on the window. I froze, my eyes darting to the glass. There was nothing there, just the dark, empty forest. I shook my head. It had to be a branch swaying in the wind, hitting the window. But as I settled back down, I heard it again, more distinct this time. Tap, tap, tap. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, slowly walking to the window. The forest outside was still, no wind to speak of, no movement. I opened the window just a crack and listened. Nothing. I closed the window and tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe my nerves were getting the best of me. I locked the window and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the house made me tense. Every gust of wind outside felt louder than it should. Around 3 a.m., I woke up with a start. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but the air felt thick, like something was wrong. I sat up in bed, listening. The cabin was eerily silent, and the darkness outside pressed in on me. I tried to go back to sleep, but it was no use. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I lay there for what felt like hours, tossing and turning, until I finally decided to get up. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, the cool air hitting me like a slap to the face. I shone the light around the cabin, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. The flashlight beam bounced off the trees, revealing nothing but shadows. I walked around the perimeter, checking the windows and doors to make sure everything was locked. But as I walked toward the back of the cabin, something caught my eye. There, on the ground, was a footprint. It wasn't a large print, but it was distinct, a boot print with the deep indentation of the heel. It led toward the woods, and I felt my stomach churn. I stared at the footprint for a moment, my heart racing. It didn't make sense. The cabin was supposed to be isolated. No one was supposed to be out here, but the footprint was undeniable. I quickly made my way back inside, locking the door behind me. I sat in the living room, the flashlight still in my hand, my mind racing. Who could have been out there? Was it a prank? Or something worse? The hours stretched on, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the room. I hadn't heard anything else outside, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Every sound in the cabin felt magnified, every creak of the floorboards sending my heart into my throat. By morning, the sun was up, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted a little. I hadn't gotten much sleep, but I felt a little better knowing that daylight had returned. Still, I couldn't shake the image of that footprint. I grabbed my things and decided to head into town, just to clear my head. The drive to the nearest town was long, but I needed to talk to someone to get a sense of normalcy back. When I arrived, I went to a small cafe and sat down with a coffee. The place was quiet, with just a few locals scattered around. I asked the barista if she knew anything about the cabin I was staying in. She paused, giving me an odd look. "That old cabin out on Pine Ridge?" she asked. I nodded. "You might want to be careful there," she said, her voice low. "It's been vacant for years. A lot of people say strange things happen out there." I felt a chill run through me, but I didn't want to show it. "Strange things? Like what?" She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Just, people hear things. Voices, footsteps. Some folks say they felt like they're being watched, but no one knows for sure. It's just one of those places that gives people the creeps." I thanked her for the information and left, my mind racing. It wasn't much, but it confirmed what I had already started to suspect. There was something about that cabin, something wrong, something that I couldn't explain. When I returned to the cabin, the unease settled over me again. But I wasn't going to let it control me. I spent the next few days trying to distract myself. I hiked, I read, I even tried fishing by a nearby stream. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always just out of sight, watching me. By the end of the week, I was ready to leave. The cabin had served its purpose, I supposed, but it wasn't the peaceful retreat I had hoped for. The strange feeling, the footprint, the silence. It all added up to a sense of dread that I couldn't ignore anymore. I packed my things and left, not looking back as I drove away. The woods seemed to swallow the cabin whole as I passed by, and for a moment, I felt like I could breathe again. I never went back to that cabin. I still think about it sometimes, though. The woods were too quiet, the air too still, and that footprint, I never figured out who or what had left it behind. Maybe some things are better left unanswered. It was the last week of September when I took time off from work and decided to go on a solo camping trip in the northern woods of Michigan. I had been stressed out for months, just working long days at the warehouse, dealing with people, traffic, noise, everything piling up on me. I didn't want to go somewhere touristy or flashy. I wanted to go somewhere quiet and isolated, where I could hear myself breathe, maybe fish a little, sit by the fire, and just reset my brain. I picked a spot I found online, a remote lake near the Upper Peninsula, barely marked on any map, surrounded by thick forest and only accessible by an old logging trail. The few reviews I found talked about how peaceful it was and how you were unlikely to see anyone else for days. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, fishing rod, a cooler, fire starter, a few knives, a small hatchet, 2 flashlights, extra batteries, and my old .22 rifle. I never really expected to use it, but I always brought it just in case I ran into a bear or something. The weather was supposed to be clear, maybe a little chilly at night, but nothing too harsh. I left early that morning, got coffee at a gas station on the way, and drove 5 hours north. The further I got, the fewer cars I saw. Eventually, I turned onto a dirt road, and after about 30 minutes of slow, bumpy driving, I reached the trailhead. The parking area was just a flat patch of dirt with enough space for maybe 2 cars. There weren't any other vehicles there. I parked, double-checked my pack, locked the truck, and started hiking. The trail was overgrown in places and barely visible in others. It wound through thick woods for about 3 miles until I reached the lake. It was just as beautiful as I'd imagined. The water was still and black, surrounded by tall pines and birch trees. No signs of people, no sound but the breeze and birds. I set up my tent near the edge of the lake, where the ground was flat and covered in pine needles. I had a good view of the water and enough distance from the trees to be safe from falling branches. After setting everything up, I gathered wood and built a fire pit with stones. I cooked some sausages over the flames and ate as the sun dipped behind the trees, turning the lake orange. That night, I slept harder than I had in months. Just the sound of leaves and crickets outside, the cold air pressing against the sides of the tent, and nothing else. The next 2 days were the same kind of peaceful. I spent my time walking around the lake, fishing, reading, and just sitting still. I didn't bring my phone except for emergencies, and I left it off most of the time. I saw deer once, drinking at the far side of the lake, and watched a bald eagle skim across the water. It was the kind of silence that makes you realize how noisy your life usually is. On the third night, something felt a little off. I had gone to sleep like usual, after eating and tending the fire until it burned down to coals. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, not suddenly, just kind of slowly becoming aware that I was awake. There wasn't any sound, not even the usual rustling or insects. I thought maybe I'd just been dreaming, but I had that odd feeling you get when your instincts are trying to tell you something. I stayed still for a long time, listening. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finally unzipped the tent quietly and stuck my head out. The moon was bright enough to see the outline of the trees, and the lake was smooth like glass. I waited, staring at the woods, trying to pick out any movement, but everything looked still. I figured it was just my imagination and went back inside, but I left my boots near the zipper in case I needed to get out quickly. It took me a while to fall back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately noticed something strange. There were small marks in the dirt near the fire pit. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, maybe raccoons or something, but they didn't look quite right. They were shallow, narrow, and came in from the woods. They stopped about 10 feet from the tent and then went back the way they came. I crouched down and studied them for a while, trying to figure out what made them. The shape wasn't right for deer or coyotes, and they were too far apart for smaller animals. They looked almost like the indentations of shoes, but not deep enough to be from someone walking normally. I brushed it off. Maybe it was an animal I wasn't familiar with. Maybe the ground was just soft in places and made weird shapes. I kept telling myself not to let my imagination get carried away. Still, I couldn't get that feeling out of my head, that sense of being watched. That day, I went for a longer hike, trying to shake off the unease. I circled the lake, taking my time, looking for signs of other people or anything unusual. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. I didn't even see any birds, which felt strange. Normally, you'd hear at least the occasional woodpecker or squirrel. It was like everything had packed up and left. I got back to camp around 5 p.m. and rebuilt the fire. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling jumpy. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. I cooked some food and ate fast, and by the time the sun went down, I was already on edge. I made sure everything was locked up in the bear canister and pulled into the tent early. I lay there in my sleeping bag, flashlight in my hand, rifle next to me, just staring at the ceiling of the tent. Around midnight, I heard it. A single footstep outside. Just one. The kind of sound someone makes when they step on a branch and break it under their weight. Not a crash, not a bunch of movement, just one deliberate, quiet snap. I didn't move. My heart started racing, and my ears strained to pick up any follow-up noise. But there was nothing. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then I heard a faint shuffle, like something brushing against the edge of the tent, down near my feet. I didn't even breathe. My flashlight was still in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position. My other hand was slowly moving toward the rifle. I wrapped my fingers around it and waited. Every muscle in my body was locked. Another few minutes passed. Then silence again. I stayed like that for at least an hour, barely blinking. I don't think I slept at all. Eventually, the sky started to lighten outside, and I felt safe enough to move. I unzipped the tent slowly and crawled out. What I saw made my stomach drop. There were boot prints all around my tent. Human boot prints. They circled the whole thing. Some passed close by the fire pit, others led toward the woods. There were at least a dozen different impressions in the pine needles and dirt, and they weren't mine. I checked. My boots were still inside the tent, dry and clean. I hadn't walked around that night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints. Then I walked toward the trees, trying to follow them. They led about 20 feet into the woods and then just vanished. The pine needles made it hard to track, and I couldn't tell where the person had come from or gone. But someone had definitely been there, watching me. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even bother folding the tent properly. Just jammed everything into my pack. I kept the rifle in my hands the whole time. When I was ready, I started hiking back down the trail, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The woods were still too quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. About halfway back to my truck, I noticed something else. A broken tree branch hanging low over the trail, about chest height. That hadn't been there before. It looked like it had been snapped intentionally and bent across the path. I stepped over it and kept moving. Another 100 yards down, I saw a pile of small rocks stacked in the middle of the trail. That hadn't been there either. Someone was following me, or maybe they'd been ahead of me. I picked up the pace, trying not to run but moving fast. I gripped the rifle tighter, constantly scanning the trees. The last half mile felt like it took an hour. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I almost broke into a sprint. The truck was untouched. I got in, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I just drove. The tires skidded a little on the dirt as I pulled out, and I didn't slow down until I was back on the main road. It took me a few hours to fully calm down. I stopped at a diner about 50 miles south and sat there with a cup of coffee, trying to make sense of everything. The prints, the noise, the rearranged trail. None of it made sense unless someone had been out there, watching me, messing with me. But why? There was nothing valuable in my camp. No one had taken anything. They could have hurt me, but they didn't. They just watched. When I got home, I didn't unpack right away. I left everything in the garage and sat in the living room with the curtains closed. For days, I kept thinking about those boot prints and the sound of that single footstep outside my tent. I checked local news for anything about missing people or strange reports near that lake. But there was nothing. I didn't report it to the police. What would I even say? I haven't gone camping alone since. I still think about it sometimes. About how far away that place was, how quiet it was, how whoever was out there knew I was alone. I think that's what gets me the most. They knew I was by myself. They knew exactly where I was. I decided to take a few days off work in the summer of 2019. I was 31 at the time, working as a building inspector in a small city in southern Oregon. I had no wife, no kids, and I'd been getting burned out. Between long drives and crawling around under floors and attics, I just needed a break. I didn't want to go too far or spend too much, so I thought I'd do a simple solo camping trip. Nothing fancy, just a weekend out in nature with no one around. I picked a place that I had driven by years ago but never explored. It was called Oak Ridge Basin, a part of the Cascade foothills that didn't get a lot of traffic. There were a few back roads leading in, some old fire service trails, and an abandoned Forest Service cabin miles away from the main roads. I wasn't interested in the cabin, just the area around it. It was deep enough in the woods that I figured I'd get some peace and quiet, maybe do a little hiking, and reset my head. I loaded up my old Ford Explorer with gear, a good tent, sleeping bag, food, water jugs, a little propane stove, and some books. I even brought a small solar charger for my phone, although I planned to keep it off most of the time. I liked the idea of being unreachable. No emails, no texts. Just trees, dirt, and quiet. I left early Friday morning. It was a warm day, not too hot, and the drive took about 2.5 hours. The last 30 minutes were rough dirt roads, winding through tall pines and uneven terrain. I had a paper map I'd printed since there was no signal out there. I found a flat, quiet spot about a mile from the old fire road, with a little clearing surrounded by pine and fir trees. There was no one around. No other cars, no trash, no signs anyone had camped there in a long time. I parked and unpacked. The ground was dry and soft with needles and leaves. I set up my tent facing a little slope that led down to a dry creek bed. I had a small campfire ring made of rocks and a couple of logs that made good seats. I didn't plan on using the fire much, just enough to keep warm in the evening. That first day was fine. I walked around the area, hiked about a mile into the woods, and found some deer tracks, a few old trail markers, and lots of silence. It was nice. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were wind in the trees and the occasional bird. I cooked some beans and rice on my little stove, read for an hour, and crawled into my tent before it got too cold. I left the rain fly off so I could see the stars. They were bright and endless out there. I slept well. The second day started off normal too. I made some coffee with my camp kettle and walked further down the creek bed, hoping to find where it might meet a river or stream. Didn't. It just curved and wound through the forest before vanishing into a patch of thicker underbrush. I followed some game trails for a while, careful not to get turned around. I marked my path with little sticks and broken twigs pointing the way back. I'm not a survivalist or anything, but I know basic trail etiquette. That afternoon, after lunch, I hiked up a ridge to the west of camp. The view was great. You could see across miles of tree-covered hills, with no buildings or roads in sight. As I started back down, I noticed something odd. There was a flat area, maybe 30 yards wide, where the trees were thinner, but not from fire or clear-cutting. It just felt wrong. Some of the trees had broken tops, not like from lightning or wind, more like they'd been snapped off. The ground had shallow divots and old tire marks, like someone had driven heavy equipment through there a long time ago. It didn't look fresh, maybe years old, but it stood out. I kept walking, made it back to camp just before dusk, and sat down to rest. I didn't think much of the odd clearing at the time. I figured it might have been a logging test site or something. I made dinner, read again, and turned in early. That night was different. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I woke up. Not from a sound, but just something felt off. You know that feeling when your body knows something before your mind does? I lay still and listened. There was no wind. No owls, no insects. Just silence. Total silence. That's what set me on edge. I sat up slowly and looked through the mesh of my tent. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I thought maybe it was just a deer or some animal passing by. I stayed awake for maybe an hour, dozing off and waking up again every few minutes. Nothing happened. Eventually, I fell asleep. In the morning, everything looked normal, but I noticed some faint impressions in the dirt about 10 feet from my tent. They weren't footprints exactly. They looked more like shallow spots in the dirt, a little longer than my shoe with rough outlines, like someone had stepped there but not fully. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked that way. They were spaced too far apart to be animal prints. Maybe someone had come through in the night, just checking things out, then left. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Could have been an animal I didn't recognize. I kept busy. I hiked east this time, through some denser patches of forest, and found what looked like an old trail completely overgrown. It had little markers nailed to trees, probably from decades ago. Some were so faded you could barely read them. One said Mile 3, and that was the only one with legible writing. I followed it for a bit until it ended at a fallen tree and thick brush. When I turned back toward camp, I felt that unease again. It wasn't like fear, more like I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone walking behind me, but there was nothing, just trees. Back at camp, I noticed one of the water jugs I had sitting by the fire ring was knocked over. It was a 5-gallon jug, and it had a dent in the side like someone had dropped it. I know I didn't leave it like that. It was sitting flat the night before. Nothing else was touched. My food was sealed. My gear was still packed neatly. But that jug, that didn't sit right. That night, I stayed up later. I didn't want to sleep. I kept my flashlight close and sat by the fire until it burned down to embers. The woods were quiet again. Too quiet. I finally climbed into the tent around midnight, zipped everything up tight, and lay there staring at the mesh ceiling. I kept the flashlight in my hand, just resting on my chest. At some point, I must have dozed off. I don't know what time it was, but I woke to a sound this time. It was soft, a crunch, like a footstep, then another. I froze. I didn't breathe. My eyes adjusted, and I saw a shape just outside the tent. Not fully clear, just a shadow blocking the starlight. It stood still, no movement. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to call out or shine the light. I just lay there. The shape moved slowly around the tent. I could hear it brushing against the fabric. Then it stopped again, near the front zipper. I held my breath so long my chest started to hurt. After a while, the shape moved off toward the trees. I heard one more crunch, then nothing. I waited a long time before moving, maybe 30 minutes. I unzipped the tent quietly and looked around. I didn't see anything. The air was cold, and the ground looked untouched.
No prints, no markings.
But I knew something had been there. I didn't sleep again. The next morning, I packed up. Fast. I didn't even make coffee or eat. I just threw everything into the back of the Explorer and got out of there. I didn't care about the rest of the trip. Something was wrong with that place. I followed my map back to the main road and didn't stop until I hit paved highway. A week later, I still couldn't shake it. So I did some research. I looked up Oak Ridge Basin, the area I camped in. It turns out there used to be some kind of research station out there in the 80s. Government-funded, small-scale logging and soil studies. But it was shut down after a couple of accidents. Equipment failures, staff going missing. Nothing major reported publicly, just a few vague mentions in forestry newsletters and online forums. No one talked about it anymore. I even found a scanned PDF from 1987 that mentioned unauthorized personnel entering restricted zones, and something about surveillance measures being reconsidered. That was it. No more details. I couldn't find anything else. I don't know who or what was out there those nights. It wasn't an animal. It didn't behave like one, and it didn't take anything. It just watched, moved around. It didn't make noise, didn't try to harm me, but it knew I was there, and I think it wanted me gone. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still hike, still spend time outdoors, but I stay in populated areas now. Trails with signs and rangers and other people. I don't need peace and quiet like that anymore. Not if it comes with that kind of silence. I was 34 the summer I took 2 weeks off work and went off the grid. It was 2018. I'd been living in Pittsburgh, working tech support for a cybersecurity company, pulling long shifts, dealing with angry customers and barely sleeping. I wasn't exactly falling apart, but I could see the cracks forming. I found the cabin listing on some obscure travel blog. It wasn't Airbnb or any of the big names, just a single post titled "Secluded Getaways. Real isolation for the worn-out mind." It featured a few hidden spots in the Northeast, and the second one caught my eye, an old hunter's cabin up in the Allegheny National Forest, near a place called Elk Ridge. The listing mentioned no Wi-Fi, no cell service, no electricity, just a generator, a water pump, and silence. That's what sold me. The guy who owned the cabin, a man named Vernon, communicated only through email. He sent me a map, an actual hand-drawn map scanned into a PDF, and told me not to rely on GPS because it would stop working 5 miles before I got close. I liked that. I needed to be unreachable. I needed space from the digital noise. So I paid him half up front through PayPal and set the dates for mid-July. I packed light, a duffel bag of clothes, a few basic tools, some dried food, a propane burner, 2 water jugs, a hatchet, a small survival knife, and my hiking boots. I didn't bother with my laptop, and I left my work phone in a drawer back home. I brought a notebook and a paperback, just in case the quiet got too loud. It was a 5-hour drive north from Pittsburgh. I reached Elk Ridge around noon, a tiny logging town with maybe 24 buildings and not a single traffic light. I filled up on gas at a rundown station, grabbed a couple more granola bars and a bag of ice, then followed the map Vernon had given me. The road narrowed into a dirt path just past an abandoned ranger station. The map told me to keep going until I passed a small wooden sign that read, "Trespassers will be shot." Then take a left and drive a mile into the trees. That's where I found it. The cabin was exactly as described. small, maybe 20 feet by 25, with a sagging roof and moss-covered steps leading to a creaky front door. The windows were old and cloudy, like they hadn't been cleaned in years. There was a fire ring out front and a rusted folding chair beside it. The generator sat off to the side under a tarp, humming softly when I flipped it on. Inside, the place was basic. One room with a cot, a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a small counter with shelves. A narrow door led to what I guessed was a composting toilet. There was no shower, no fridge. The air inside smelled like dust, wood, and the faintest trace of mildew. I dumped my gear, opened a window, and sat outside for a while. The forest stretched out around me like a wall. Thick trees, no sounds but birds and the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush. Felt untouched, and it felt good. The first 2 days were everything I hoped for. I cooked simple meals, wrote in the notebook, took long hikes along barely there animal trails, and listened to the wind move through the trees. At night, the darkness was complete. No streetlights, no distant hum of cars, just blackness and the chorus of insects. I hadn't realized how much I missed that kind of silence until I was surrounded by it. But by the 3rd day, I started noticing things. Small things. Nothing big enough to ring any alarms, not at first. Just details that felt off. The first was the firewood. When I arrived, there was a neat stack beside the cabin. Split, dry, ready to burn. But on the 3rd morning, I noticed a few pieces had been moved. Not taken, just shifted, like someone had grabbed a few logs and set them down again. I thought maybe an animal had knocked them over. But there were no claw marks, no droppings, no sign of anything digging. Then there was the footprint. I found it near the creek about a half-mile from the cabin. Not mine. I was wearing thick-soled hiking boots. This was from a different kind of shoe, worn, thin-soled, maybe a work boot. It was partially smudged in the mud but deep. Someone else had walked through there recently. Still, I told myself not to spiral. It was probably Vernon, the cabin owner, checking on the place. Or maybe a hunter scouting the area. Even if the cabin was remote, it didn't mean I was the only human for miles. That night, I left the generator running a bit later. I didn't like the idea of being watched. I didn't hear anything strange. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept imagining the crunch of footsteps outside, the creak of the front steps. Every gust of wind felt like movement. I finally dozed off sometime after 3 a.m., the flashlight gripped tight in my hand. Day 4, I hiked farther out, toward a ridge that overlooked the valley. It was a clear day, and from up there, I could see for miles, just endless green, hills rolling into the horizon. I sat there for a while, calming down, convincing myself the cabin wasn't being watched, that I'd let my imagination get the best of me. On the way back, I noticed something that stopped me cold. About 200 yards from the cabin, hidden behind a dense patch of brush, was a path. Not an animal trail, a man-made one. Someone had cleared branches, trampled grass. It was recent. I followed it for maybe 20 yards before it curved toward the west and disappeared into thicker trees. I didn't go farther. I got back to the cabin and double-checked the door locks. There weren't many, just a flimsy bolt and a latch, but I wedged a chair under the handle too. I didn't cook that night. I sat in the dark, generator off, waiting. Nothing happened. No knocks, no sounds. But I didn't sleep. Day 5 was when things changed. I woke up to find the folding chair gone. The one outside by the fire ring. I'd left it leaned back against the cabin wall. Now it was just gone. I circled the area for 20 minutes, thinking maybe it got blown over or an animal dragged it. Nothing. Then I checked the fire pit. It had been disturbed. Someone had tried to start a fire. There were small charred twigs in the center, arranged carefully, but never lit. I packed my bag. I didn't care that I had another week booked. I was done. I had the map, I knew the way out. But the road had other plans. I walked the mile back to the dirt road and kept going toward the ranger station where I'd entered. It should have taken me less than 2 hours on foot. But the path was blocked. Trees, big ones, had fallen across the road like they'd been cut. Not storm damage. These were clean breaks. Someone had dropped them with a chainsaw. I backtracked, heart pounding, thinking I must have taken a wrong turn. I hadn't. That's when I noticed something else. At the edge of the fallen trees, nailed into the trunk of one, was a new sign. It wasn't there when I came in. It was a flat wooden board, spray-painted red with crude white letters. Not safe. Go back. I stood there for a long time, not sure if I should laugh or cry. It didn't feel like a prank. Felt like a warning. I turned back toward the cabin, brain racing. Who was out here? Why block the only road in or out? Why now? I didn't go back inside. I grabbed my gear from the porch, stashed food and water in my pack, and decided to hike the ridge trail again. From there, I could maybe spot another way out. Even if I had to bushwhack for hours, I figured I'd eventually hit a road or house. I made it to the ridge before sunset. From up there, I scanned every direction. Then I saw it, movement. Below, maybe 300 yards from the cabin, was a figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes. They weren't walking. They were standing, still, facing the cabin. I didn't move. I watched for 10 minutes. They didn't budge. I crawled back from the ridge on my stomach, heart hammering in my throat. Then I circled wide, staying in the trees until nightfall. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't light a fire. I found a spot between two boulders and hunkered down, wrapped in my jacket, knife in hand, every twig snap making me flinch. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. The sound of a chainsaw in the distance. Not close, but not far either. Just revving, stopping, then starting again. I stayed frozen. It lasted maybe 5 minutes. Then silence. The next morning, I moved. I followed the sun, heading east, keeping low, staying off trails. I rationed my food, drank from the creek, purified it with iodine tabs. I hiked for hours, legs burning, eyes scanning every direction. I didn't see anyone, but I felt watched, constantly. On the second day of hiking, I finally saw a sign of civilization. A barbed wire fence, rusted and sagging, marking the boundary of what looked like a long abandoned farm. Beyond that was a dirt path, and a mile later I saw the outline of a building, another ranger station, this one intact. I stumbled into the lot, banged on the door until someone opened it. An older guy in uniform stared at me like I was a ghost. I told him I'd been hiking, got lost, needed help. I didn't mention the cabin. Not yet. My name's Mason. Back in 2017, I was 28 years old and stuck in a rut I didn't see coming. I just quit my job in Boston. Some marketing gig that paid well but had me staring at screens for 12 hours a day. My girlfriend had left a few months earlier. Said I was distant. Said I was becoming someone she didn't recognize. She was right. That fall, I started to spiral. I drank more, slept during the day, ignored friends, ignored bills. When winter hit, I realized I needed to get out of the city, somewhere cold and quiet. Just me, no distractions. I found a place on an old forum. Somebody was renting out a remote cabin in northern Vermont for cheap. Guy said it had wood heat, a basic kitchen, no Wi-Fi, no cell reception. Sounded perfect. The drive took most of the day. Snow had started falling just north of Montpelier, and by the time I hit the turnoff near a town called Craftsbury, visibility was getting bad. The GPS on my old Subaru gave out 10 miles past the last gas station. I followed the directions I'd printed off, winding through back roads lined with leafless trees and snow-covered stone walls. Every few miles I passed an old barn or a rundown farmhouse, but mostly it was just woods. Dark, wet woods that closed in on both sides like a tunnel. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt road that curved downhill through a birch grove. It looked smaller than I'd expected, single-story, weathered cedar planks, a rusted metal chimney poking out from the roof. There was a small woodshed to the side and a frozen creek just down the slope. The place had a tilted porch with one broken step and a screen door hanging by one hinge. Inside, it was dark and cold. The front room was one big open space with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen tucked into the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and an old couch that looked like it had seen better decades. A hallway led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. The air smelled like mildew and wood smoke. A few spider webs hung in the corners. I lit a fire first thing. Took forever to get going. The logs in the shed were damp and half-rotted, but after enough newspaper and frustration, the flames finally caught. I unpacked my gear, just a duffel bag with clothes, a box of canned food, a few bottles of water, and a flask I'd filled with bourbon for emergencies. I set up my laptop even though there was no Wi-Fi, just to journal or watch movies I'd downloaded. But mostly I planned to read, right? Maybe go hiking once the weather cleared. The first night was peaceful. I remember that. The fire popped quietly, and snow tapped at the windows like tiny fingers. It was the kind of quiet that made you realize how loud cities were. No cars, no people yelling, just wind and trees. I slept well under a pile of old quilts I found in the bedroom closet. But the peace didn't last. It started the second night. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. Not a crash or bang, just this slow, rhythmic creaking, like someone walking in circles on the porch. I sat up, heart thudding, and held my breath. Kept going, a step every few seconds. Would groaning under weight. It stopped after a minute. I figured maybe it was a deer, or the wind shifting the porch boards. Still, I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, I saw footprints in the snow outside the front door. Human ones, boot prints. They circled the cabin once and disappeared back into the woods. They weren't mine. I'd stayed inside all day. They were spaced far apart, like the person was tall or walking fast. I told myself it was probably a local hunter. Maybe someone checking out the place, thinking it was empty. The guy I rented from hadn't mentioned neighbors, but I hadn't asked either. Still, the sight of those tracks, fresh and clear, made the skin on my neck prickle. I spent the day chopping some of the dryer wood I found at the bottom of the stack. I tried to distract myself with reading, cooking, and writing nonsense in my journal. But every sound outside made me twitch. The wind in the trees, branches falling, snow shifting on the roof. I didn't sleep that night either. The third night, something woke me again. This time it was a scrape, like metal on wood. Came from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen. I sat up on the couch, where I'd been dozing with the fire dying out. The sound came again. Scrape, pause, scrape. I crept into the kitchen and looked out the back window. Nothing but darkness and trees. In the morning, I found more tracks. This time, they led from the creek up to the back of the house. Someone had walked right up to the rear wall and just stood there. No boot prints leading away, just a set of them straight to the wall and nothing else. I tried to convince myself they'd been covered by snowfall, but I knew better. The snow was light, barely an inch. No way it erased footprints that quickly. That afternoon, I dragged an old dresser in front of the back door. I wedged a chair under the knob for good measure. I didn't own a gun, but I did have a hunting knife and a hammer, which I kept near me at all times after that. I didn't want to leave early. I told myself I was overreacting, but something felt wrong. It wasn't just the tracks. It was a feeling, like I was being watched. On the fourth night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the fire with the lights off, wrapped in a blanket, eyes on the windows. Around 3 a.m., I saw movement. Just a flicker, a shape moving past the front window. I froze, didn't breathe. A few seconds later, I heard a soft thud on the porch. Then that same creaking again. One step, pause, another step. Whoever it was stopped right in front of the door. Then silence. I sat there for what felt like an hour. Never moved, never blinked. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. In the morning, I found the snow on the porch disturbed, like someone had stood there a long time, shuffling their feet. The footprints led down the hill toward the trees. I followed them for about 50 feet before they disappeared into the underbrush. No sign of who made them. That day, I almost left. I packed my bag, threw everything into the car, and started it up. But the engine made a weird grinding noise and then died. I tried again. Nothing. Battery was fine. Fuel gauge said I had a quarter tank, but it wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood. Everything looked normal, but I'm no mechanic. I went back inside, heart sinking. I kept the fire going all day and tried not to panic. That night, I left the lights on, every single one. I sat with the hammer in my lap, barely blinking. No movement, no sounds. But the next morning, I found something new. On the porch railing, someone had scratched a message into the wood. Just 2 words, "Stay inside." I stared at it for a long time. My hands were shaking. I knew I had to leave. I didn't care if I had to hike out. I packed everything into my bag and started walking down the road toward where I came from. But after a mile or so, I saw something that made me stop. My tire tracks, the ones I'd made driving in, were gone, covered, but not by snow. Someone had raked the snow smooth, like they didn't want anyone to find the cabin. I turned back. I didn't know what else to do. I was in the middle of nowhere with no phone, no working car, no idea who was out there. I figured it'd be safer to stay inside during the day and only hike out once I had a solid plan. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard banging at the back door. Not knocking, banging, like someone slamming their fists into the wood over and over. The chair wedged under the knob held, but the whole door shook. I grabbed the hammer and stood there, heart racing, not breathing. After a minute, the banging stopped. Then I heard footsteps running around the side of the cabin. I sprinted to the front door just in time to see someone disappear into the woods. Tall, wearing dark clothes, moving fast. I didn't sleep. I didn't even sit down. I waited for daylight, then moved the dresser away, grabbed my pack, and started walking again. This time I followed the creek downstream, thinking it might lead to a road. It took me half the day, but eventually I came out near a dirt road with tire tracks. Real ones, fresh. I followed them until I saw a mailbox and an old farmhouse. The man who lived there called the sheriff for me. He was quiet, looked at me strange when I told him where I'd been, said that cabin hadn't been rented out in years. Said the owner, a guy named Harrow, had died 2 winters ago. The sheriff came, asked me a few questions, then drove me back to the cabin to check things out. It was empty, no footprints, no scratches on the railing, nothing disturbed, but my car still wouldn't start. Sheriff had it towed to town. Turns out someone had pulled out a few spark plug wires. Deliberately, they never found who did it. I didn't stay the night in town. I rented a car and drove straight back to Boston. That was 8 years ago. I haven't gone camping since. Haven't stepped foot in Vermont either. I think about it a lot, who was out there, why they didn't break in, what they meant by stay inside. I don't have answers. Just the memory of a cold, It was the summer of 2017. I was 34 years old, working as a freelance photographer, mostly doing nature work. That year, I had taken on fewer assignments to make space for personal projects. One of those projects was to explore lesser-known camping spots in the western part of Colorado and photograph them in different lighting, sunrise, sunset, and under overcast skies. I had a decent 4x4 and a set of sturdy camping gear I'd built up over the years. I wasn't new to camping. I'd spent weeks alone in remote forests, on mountain trails, and even desert edges. I was confident in my skills: navigation, first aid, building fires, filtering water, you name it. I'd never had a real scare before, not even close. There was this area I'd been reading about online called Echo Valley. It wasn't in any big tourist guides. Just a handful of off-the-grid forums mentioned it. Supposedly, it was a forgotten trail near the western slope of the Uncompahgre Plateau, surrounded by steep hills, pine trees, and a creek that ran year-round. Some folks said it used to be a scout campsite back in the 80s, but after a bad flood, people stopped going. No one I personally knew had been there. That's what pulled me in. I planned a 3-day solo trip. I packed light but carefully: tent, sleeping bag, knife, bear spray, a .357 revolver I always brought on remote trips, portable stove, water purifier, satellite phone, and extra batteries. I loaded up my truck with food sealed in odor-proof bags and headed out on a Monday morning. It was early August, hot during the day, but the nights were cold up there. I reached the nearest service road by mid-afternoon, then drove another 40 minutes on a barely visible dirt path until I couldn't go further without risking damage to the truck. From there, it was a 2-hour hike into the woods. The path was overgrown but visible enough if you looked for broken branches or slight indentations in the grass. I followed the creek upstream as suggested in the forums. By the time I reached a decent flat area next to the creek, it was nearly 6 p.m. I set up camp fast, pitched the tent, gathered dry wood for a fire, and filtered water. There was a strange stillness in the air. The only sound was the water running over rocks and the occasional bird. No wind.
No insects buzzing.
Just quiet. I chalked it up to being deep in the valley, away from everything. That first night was uneventful. I made a small fire, heated up a can of chili, and sat with my back against a tree, watching the stars come out. Around 10 p.m., I turned in. The ground was firm but not too rocky. I slept well. The second day I spent exploring. I walked a couple of miles in each direction along the creek, taking photos and marking my path with biodegradable tape so I could find my way back. I noticed some old fire rings and metal stakes in the ground, signs people had camped here years ago. At one point, I found a rusted-out Coleman stove buried under leaves. That confirmed the scout camp theory. Around late afternoon, I hiked up a ridge on the north side of the valley to get a wide-angle photo of the area. That's when I saw something that made me stop. Across the valley, maybe half a mile away, near the tree line, I saw a glint, like light reflecting off glass or metal. It was brief, maybe half a second, but enough to catch my attention. I stared for a while, waiting to see it again, but nothing moved. I figured it could be an old beer bottle or maybe a deer moving through a sunbeam. I took a few photos and headed back down before the light disappeared. That night, after dinner, I sat by the fire again. The same stillness surrounded me. At one point, I thought I heard a soft cracking sound in the distance, like a branch snapping under weight, but it didn't repeat, and I've heard branches fall on their own plenty of times. Still, I kept the revolver closer to my sleeping bag than usual. I woke up sometime after midnight. I didn't know what exactly woke me, but my eyes shot open. My tent was closed, and everything was quiet. Too quiet. The creek sounded muffled, like something was dampening the air. I lay there for a minute, listening, holding my breath. Then I heard it again. A soft crunch, like footsteps on dry leaves, not too far from the tent. Now, footsteps in the woods don't always mean danger. Deer walk through camps. Raccoons snoop around. But these steps were slow and deliberate. Step, pause, step, pause. I sat up slowly, grabbed the revolver, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black except for the moonlight filtering through the pines. The fire was out, just embers. I stayed like that for about 5 minutes, staring into the woods, heart pounding. Nothing moved. Eventually, the steps faded. I didn't hear them leave, just nothing again. I stayed awake until dawn, lying still, gun in hand, ears straining. As the sky lightened, birds returned, and the normal forest sounds came back. It was like whatever had been near was gone with the dark. I got up, made coffee, and checked the perimeter. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign of animals or people. I debated cutting the trip short, but stubbornness won out. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe just my nerves. Still, I didn't stray too far that third day. I stayed close to camp, kept the fire going, and spent more time watching than taking pictures. Around noon, I heard something faint in the distance. Sounded like metal clanging. Not loud, but out of place. I couldn't place the direction. It lasted maybe 2 seconds and stopped. No echo, no follow-up. I climbed back up the ridge that evening, hoping to catch the sunset and maybe figure out what I'd seen the day before. This time, I brought my telephoto lens. I scanned the tree line where I'd seen the glint. Nothing. But when I looked slightly west of that spot, I noticed something odd. A small structure barely visible between trees. It looked like wood, maybe a shed or an old cabin. I hadn't noticed it before, probably hidden by the angle or lighting. I zoomed in and snapped a few photos. The building looked weathered, almost collapsed in parts. But what really got me was a figure, a person, standing outside it, dressed in dark clothes, still as stone, facing the valley. I froze. The distance was too far to see details, But this wasn't a hunter. No orange vest, no gear. Just a lone figure staring. I packed up fast and rushed down the ridge, heart racing. I didn't run. I didn't want to draw attention, but I moved fast. Back at camp, I didn't eat. I doused the fire early and climbed into the tent just before sunset. I kept the gun in my hand. I didn't sleep. All night I listened. I heard rustling a few times, faint sounds, too far to pinpoint. Once I thought I heard breathing outside the tent. Not loud, but close enough that I held my breath and didn't move for 10 minutes. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed everything up by 6 a.m., barely stopping to eat. I loaded my gear and began the hike back to the truck. I checked behind me every few minutes. My nerves were shredded. When I reached the truck and locked the doors, I sat there for 5 minutes, just breathing. I started the engine and took off down the dirt road, only slowing when I hit pavement again. I drove straight to the nearest town, Montrose, checked into a cheap motel and showered for an hour. Later that night, I looked through the photos I'd taken. The structure was clearer in one of the shots. Definitely a shed or one-room cabin. The figure, though, it was gone. In the photo, there was no one there, just trees. I could have sworn I saw someone. I stared at it for hours, zoomed in, changed contrast, brightness, nothing. I reported the cabin to the ranger station the next day, told them I thought someone might be squatting out there and acting strangely. They said they'd look into it. I never heard back. I never went back to Echo Valley. I still go camping, but I stick to known areas now, trails with other people nearby. That trip changed something in me. It wasn't fear of animals or getting lost. It was the silence, the way the air felt wrong, the way someone or something moved through those woods without making a sound when it wanted to. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters. I believe in people, and I think someone was watching me out there. Maybe they lived there. Maybe they didn't like visitors. Maybe they were just waiting to see what I'd do. I didn't stay long enough to find out, and I never will. It was early September of 2017 when I decided I needed a break from the city. I had just turned 31, and life had been pulling me in too many directions at once. I worked in insurance, mostly behind a desk, trapped under fluorescent lights, and answering calls from angry people who didn't read their policies. I had no family in the city, few friends, and the kind of persistent fatigue that builds up slowly over the years without you even realizing it. One morning, I stared at my face in the mirror, pale from the artificial light and lack of sun, and said to myself, I need out. So I booked a week off work, packed up my car with some basic gear, and drove north. I didn't have a solid plan, just a general direction. I ended up in northern Oregon, near the border with Washington. I'd found a place on an old backpacking forum, not an official campground, more of a local spot known among hikers and loners. It was called Seven Pines Ridge. The guy who posted about it said it was quiet, isolated, and beautiful. A ridge that ran along a forgotten section of forest just off an old logging road, with a small stream running through it. Sounded perfect. No people, no signal, and no noise. Took me nearly 5 hours to get there. I left Portland around 6 in the morning, took I-5 north, then veered off onto a bunch of state routes that twisted through small, almost forgotten towns. By the time I turned off the paved road onto the dirt track that led to the ridge, my GPS had stopped working. I didn't mind. That was kind of the point. The dirt road was rough. My old Subaru groaned over rocks and dipped into deep ruts, the kind that make your stomach rise just a bit if you go too fast. Trees pressed in from both sides. The forest felt old, damp, and undisturbed. I passed a rusted sign nailed to a post. Asterisk, Seven Pines Ridge Trailhead, no services. Asterisk, it was tilted. The lettering faded. I parked in a small clearing that barely fit my car, grabbed my backpack, and headed in on foot. The trail was narrow but visible. Moss covered almost everything, trees, rocks, even fallen logs. After about an hour of hiking, I found a flat patch near the stream, not far from the ridge's edge, where the trees thinned just enough to get a sliver of a view to the west. You could see rolling tree-covered hills that stretched out for miles. It was perfect. I set up my tent, built a small fire ring from nearby stones, and sat on a fallen log, just listening. No cars, no people, just wind in the branches and water trickling through roots and rocks. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some beans on my little camp stove, drank water from my filter bottle, and wrote in a small notebook. I slept surprisingly well. The air was cold, but fresh. I woke with the sun, sore from the ground, but clear-headed for the first time in months. The second day, I hiked further up the ridge. I didn't see a soul. There were no wrappers, no fire pits, no beer cans. Signs I'd come to expect even in untouched areas. This really was remote. I found some deer tracks near the stream and once saw what I thought might have been a coyote, but it darted away before I could get a good look. That night, I stayed up later. The stars were insane. No light pollution, just a sky bursting with pinpoints of white, a dome of silent infinity overhead. It was the third night when things started to feel off. It began with a sound. I just crawled into my sleeping bag. The fire had burned low, just red coals glowing faintly. I was halfway between sleep and wakefulness when I heard it. A snap, not a twig underfoot, not that sharp dry crack, but more like a dull pop, like a thick branch being twisted and broken. I sat up, listened. The forest was still, but not silent. Crickets chirped. Something small moved through leaves nearby, probably a squirrel. But then I heard another sound, closer this time. A slow crunching like footsteps, heavy, deliberate ones. Then silence. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or an elk. But I'd grown up hiking in Montana. I knew the sound of animals moving through brush. These weren't quick, light, or erratic. They were slow and spaced like someone walking. I stayed still, hand resting on the knife by my pack. I didn't sleep much that night, just lay there, ears straining in the dark. Morning came and everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I walked the perimeter around my site, didn't find any footprints, but I did find something odd. A tree about 30 yards from my tent, freshly gouged with marks. Not scratches, not like claws, but long vertical lines that looked like they'd been made with a blade. Clean, deliberate cuts. 3 of them evenly spaced. I told myself it could have been old damage. I told myself I hadn't noticed it earlier. I went about my day as usual. Hiked some, collected wood, filtered more water. But I kept glancing at that tree. That night it rained. Not heavy, just a cold drizzle that crept into your clothes and stuck. I stayed in my tent, wrapped in my bag, reading a paperback. Around 1 a.m., I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. This time, there was no wind to blame, no dry branches to snap in the breeze. The sound came from just beyond my tent, from the direction of the stream. It moved slowly, deliberately, circling wide. I lay frozen. My knife was under my pillow. I slid my hand toward it, heart hammering. Then I heard a low thud, like something being dropped, followed by silence. I didn't sleep. When the sky finally lightened, I stepped out. The drizzle had stopped. The forest smelled like wet leaves and earth. At the edge of the stream, I saw it. A pile of rocks, stacked deliberately, 5 of them, each one placed with precision like a little monument that hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. Now I started to feel genuinely unsettled. Someone was nearby. I packed my things. Fast. Took down the tent, shoved everything into my backpack, and headed back down the trail. I figured I could make it to the car in under an hour if I moved fast. But about 15 minutes in, I stopped cold. There were boot prints in the mud, deep ones, fresh, leading toward my campsite. They weren't mine. I wear trail runners. These were heavier, like work boots, treaded, large, size 11, maybe 12. They weren't there when I came in. I felt like I was being watched. I started walking faster. Every sound behind me made my skin crawl. At one point, I even broke into a jog, heart pounding. When I finally reached the clearing, my car was there, untouched. No signs of anyone else. But I didn't feel safe until I was back on the paved road, reception bars lighting up on my phone. I drove to the nearest town, a place called Oak Hollow. Tiny, A single gas station, a diner, and a post office. I sat in the diner for an hour, just nursing coffee and staring at the table. My thoughts were racing. Was it a hunter? A drifter? Someone living off-grid? Why come so close to my tent? Why leave the rock pile? Eventually, I booked a room at a motel and stayed the night. I couldn't go back to the ridge, and I didn't want to go home yet either. I needed to clear my head, but the story doesn't end there. A week later, back in Portland, I kept thinking about it. I told myself I'd imagined things. Maybe I'd been on edge, sleep deprived, but I couldn't stop wondering. So I did something I probably shouldn't have. I went online and searched for Seven Pines Ridge. Not the hiking forum, I went deeper. Old news stories, obscure blogs, local reports. That's when I found it. An article from 2004, archived in a local newspaper. A missing hiker, a man named Greg Walters, 29. He'd gone missing near Seven Pines Ridge. His car was found at the same clearing I'd parked at. Search and rescue found his tent, undisturbed. His gear was still there, but he was gone, never found. There was another case, 2011. A woman, same spot. Her tent was slashed open. Her pack was found a mile away. She was later found wandering the forest, barefoot, incoherent. She'd refused to speak to authorities. Eventually ended up in a psychiatric facility. I felt sick. This wasn't just in my head. I never went back. I sold the camping gear, changed my car, moved to a different apartment. I don't even go to public parks anymore. I still think about that third night. The sound of the steps, the rock pile, the knife marks in the tree. Someone was there watching me, not trying to kill me, just watching, waiting. And that's what haunts me the most. It wasn't what happened. It's what could have happened if I had stayed one more night. I went camping alone in the summer of 2017. I was 29 at the time, living in Bozeman, Montana. I'd always been into hiking, especially backcountry stuff where you don't see other people for days. I worked as a freelance mechanic, mostly out of my garage, so I had the flexibility to plan trips around weather and clients. That summer had been a string of hot days and clear skies, so I decided to head to the Tobacco Root Mountains for a few nights. I'd been there before, but never this deep. I planned a 3-day hike, starting from South Meadow Creek Trailhead. My destination was a ridge just west of Hollowtop Lake. It wasn't on the main trail. I had found it months earlier on a satellite map. Looked secluded and scenic. I wanted quiet, real quiet, the kind that makes you notice the sound of your own heartbeat. I packed my gear the night before, nothing fancy, just the basics. Tent, food, first aid, emergency GPS, bear spray, a knife, and my old 9mm pistol. I'd carried the pistol since my early 20s, but never had to use it for anything more than scaring off a raccoon. I always brought it. It made me feel better being out there alone. I had 3 days worth of dehydrated meals, a compact stove, a full water bladder, and iodine tablets just in case. My phone was fully charged, but I knew it wouldn't have reception where I was going. I left the next morning around 5:30 a.m., drove out in my old Tacoma, and reached the trailhead by 8. There were only 2 other cars in the lot. I signed the trail register and started my hike. Weather was perfect, mid-70s. Dry, barely any wind. The first 6 miles were easy, mostly open meadows and pine forests. I passed one older couple heading back the other way. We waved but didn't stop. That was the last person I saw for the entire trip. I left the main trail around noon, veering off toward the ridge I'd marked on my map. The terrain started changing, rockier, steeper. By 3 p.m., I reached a small plateau halfway up the ridge. It wasn't flat, but there was enough level ground to pitch my tent. I had a view of the entire valley below, a dense line of forest running up both sides. I could see the lake in the distance, almost black under the sun. I made a quick meal, set up camp, and just sat there for a while, letting the silence wash over me. No cars, no people, no sounds but wind through pine and the occasional chirp of birds. It was the kind of peace you don't get anywhere near civilization. Night came fast in the mountains. By 9 p.m., the sky was black and the stars came out like pinholes in a dark curtain. I crawled into my sleeping bag and was out cold by 10. First night was uneventful, except for some strange creaking sounds outside my tent around 3 a.m. I figured it was a deer or something brushing past a tree. I didn't get up to check. I was too tired to care. The second day started smooth. I hiked farther up the ridge in the morning. No pack, just water and a snack. I found a shallow rock overhang near the peak and made a mental note of it in case weather turned. Got back to camp around 1 p.m., boiled water for a meal, and was sitting in the shade when I saw something odd down in the trees. About 200 yards down the slope, something was moving between the pines, not fast but deliberate. I squinted and waited for a better view. Could have been a bear, but it was upright. Not fully, more like crouched, weaving between the trees slowly. I stayed still, not breathing, trying to track it. It moved behind a boulder and didn't come out the other side. I waited a full minute. Nothing. I pulled out my binoculars but saw only trees and stone. I scanned the area for 10 more minutes and saw nothing else. I told myself it was probably a hunter or another camper, maybe someone gathering firewood. Still, it sat wrong in my gut. I kept my pistol on me for the rest of the afternoon, even while boiling water or lying in my tent. That evening, things felt off. Wind shifted directions. Birds stopped chirping. It was like the whole mountain took a breath and held it. I started hearing light snapping sounds from the treeline again, just like the night before, but this time more frequent, closer. I shouted once, just to see if anyone would respond. Nothing. No echo, no movement. That night, I barely slept. I laid there, pistol in hand, eyes open in the dark, listening. The third morning was cold, much colder than the previous days. The kind of cold that gets into your fingernails. I packed up early, thinking I'd hike back to the truck and call it. I wasn't enjoying myself anymore. I felt watched, followed even. I was about to collapse my tent when I noticed boot prints behind it. Fresh. Not mine. Heavier tread, wider gait. They came from the treeline, circled my camp, and left the way they came. I stood there staring at them, not moving. My chest tightened. I hadn't heard anyone approach during the night. No voices.
No lights.
Just those soft snaps. I grabbed my gear and started down the ridge fast, skipping breakfast. I took the same route I came up, cutting through the same stretch of trees. Every sound set me on edge. A pine cone dropping felt like a gunshot. My steps were fast, sloppy. I tripped more than once. At one point, I heard movement behind me. Branches crunching, not close, but not far either. I spun around, eyes scanning the trees. Nothing. I waited in total silence. After 2 minutes, it stopped. I started moving again, slower this time, back against the slope. By noon, I was close to where the ridge rejoined the main trail, maybe 20 minutes out. That's when I found the shirt, caught on a low branch, half torn, stained dark red in a few places. It was flannel, the kind you find in every outdoor store. There was no smell, no blood on the ground, just the shirt hanging like bait. I didn't touch it. I stared for a long time, then moved past it wide, keeping my back to a tree. When I reached the main trail, I nearly broke into a run. I don't remember much of that last stretch, just the thudding in my chest and the way the woods seemed darker than before. The parking lot was empty when I got back. No cars, not even mine. That's when I realized I'd parked farther down the trail access road, where there was overflow parking. I almost laughed from the panic that hit me when I didn't see my truck. I walked another 5 minutes and saw it, just where I'd left it. Everything was as I had left it. I checked the doors, the bed, even underneath. Nothing was missing. Nothing was placed there either, which I half expected for some reason. I got in and locked the doors. The drive back to Bozeman was 2 hours. I didn't stop once. I didn't look in the rearview mirror more than I had to. I got home, dumped my gear in the garage, locked every door and window in the house, and sat on my couch until the sun went down. I didn't sleep well for weeks. Every sound in the house made me jump. I kept checking the windows. I even set up a motion light in my backyard. A few days later, I reported the shirt to the local Forest Service office. I didn't mention the footprints or the feeling of being followed. Just said I'd found a piece of torn clothing near Hollowtop Lake. They said they'd send a ranger to check it out. I never heard back. That trip changed something in me. I still go hiking, but not alone. Not anymore. I stay on marked trails. I carry a satellite phone now, not just a GPS beacon. And I haven't gone back to the tobacco roots since. Some people think that fear is about monsters or ghosts or haunted cabins. It's not. Real fear is the knowledge that someone else is out there with you in the silence. Watching, waiting, never saying a word. That's what I felt up there. Not a ghost, not a bear, a man. A stranger who knew I was there, who circled my camp, who walked those same woods in total silence. That was real. And I think if I'd stayed one more night, I wouldn't be writing this. I was 34 when I decided to take some time away from everything. Work had been wearing me thin, and after almost a decade in Chicago, the city noise started to get under my skin in a way I hadn't expected. My name's Tom Russell. I worked in marketing back then, but the burnout hit hard that year, 2022, early fall. I needed quiet, somewhere far enough from people where I didn't have to think or be anyone for a little while. A friend of a friend had a cabin up in northern Idaho, not far from Priest Lake. Said it was empty most of the year, and I could use it for as long as I needed. That sounded perfect. The cabin was about 12 miles off the nearest highway, sitting in the thick woods, surrounded by pine and cedar. The closest town was Coolin, and even that was a good drive out. I stocked up on food, filled my truck with supplies, and made the trip up in early October, just as the trees were beginning to lose their leaves. That drive into the woods felt like I was peeling away layers of the world. No cell signal, no traffic, just gravel roads narrowing the deeper I went. It was peaceful, like I was being swallowed by the forest. When I pulled up to the cabin, it looked exactly like the kind of place you'd imagine for something like this, old, but kept up. One story, made of faded logs with a pitched green roof and a small porch out front. It had a single bedroom, a kitchen with a wood stove, and a small living room with a couple old chairs and a stone fireplace. No TV, no internet. The power came from a generator out back, and water was pulled from a nearby well. It was the kind of place that forces you to slow down. The first few days were uneventful. I spent time hiking the trails around the property, making simple meals, reading. The quiet out there had a weight to it, thick and unbroken except for the wind and the sound of branches moving. Nights came early, and it got cold fast. I'd keep the fire going most evenings, listening to the crackle of burning wood, the distant hoot of an owl, and nothing else. I started writing in a notebook, just thoughts at first, little journal entries. I hadn't done anything like that since college. Something about being that isolated made me want to get things down on paper. That's how I remember the order of things, looking back, day by day, entry by entry. It was the fifth night when I first noticed something strange. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly, not from a sound, but from a feeling. You know that sense you get when you're being watched? That heavy awareness? That's what pulled me from sleep. The cabin was silent. The fire had burned down low, and everything was still. I sat up in bed and waited, not really sure what I was expecting. I didn't hear anything. Eventually, I chalked it up to nerves and went back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside and walked the perimeter, just out of curiosity. The ground was soft with pine needles and some early frost, but nothing looked out of place. There were a few animal tracks, maybe a deer or something smaller. I figured maybe I'd been dreaming. That happens out there with no light pollution and complete silence. You start to fill the void with your own thoughts. But then it happened again the next night. I woke up around the same time, 2 a.m., but this time, I heard something. Not footsteps exactly, but a shift in pressure, a dull thud, like weight on a wooden step. I stayed still, straining to hear more, but it didn't repeat. After a long while, I got out of bed and looked through the front window. The porch was empty. I stayed up for a few hours after that, just sitting in the dark with a flashlight in hand, listening. By day 7, I was uneasy. The woods no longer felt as welcoming. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder during hikes. Every time I went out, I had this tight feeling in my gut, like something was just out of sight. I found myself coming back to the cabin earlier and earlier, locking the door behind me even though I was miles from the nearest person. That night, I woke again. This time, I heard a definite sound. A scrape metal on wood. Came from the side of the cabin, near the window. I sat up fast, heart pounding. It was pitch dark, but the fire still had some glow. I grabbed my flashlight and stood still, barely breathing. The scraping stopped. I moved toward the front of the cabin slowly, then heard another sound. Something tapping against the wall. Not hard, but deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't open the door. I waited. After maybe a minute, it stopped. Nothing followed. I stayed up the rest of the night, light on, eyes fixed on the window. The next morning, I went outside and circled the cabin. On the north wall, near the bedroom window, I found marks. Scratches. Fresh, long, and shallow. It looked like someone had dragged something sharp across the logs. Not an animal. I knew the difference. These weren't claw marks. They were too clean, too intentional. Like someone had done it slowly, just to mess with me. That day, I walked further out into the woods, searching for signs. Boot prints, a trail, anything. I didn't find much, but about 200 yards east of the cabin, I came across something that stopped me cold. A small clearing with a fire pit recently used. Blackened wood, scorched earth, and something else half buried in the dirt, a food wrapper. The same kind I had in the cabin. I hadn't left any outside. I was sure of it. I took it as a warning. Someone had been watching me, possibly coming near the cabin at night. I packed a bag that evening, planning to head back to town the next morning. But part of me didn't want to leave in the dark. I figured if I could hold out until sunrise, I'd drive out and be done with the whole thing. That night was the worst. Around midnight, the generator cut off. That had never happened before. I stepped outside to check it and immediately felt like something was wrong. The air was colder than usual, the woods too quiet. No wind, no insects, no distant rustle of animals. Just complete silence. The generator looked fine, no leaks, still had gas. I restarted it and went back inside, locking the door again. Maybe 5 minutes later, I heard a knock. Not on the door, on the window. Just one. A soft, single knock. Then another, from the back of the cabin. Then one from the side. Different windows, one after the other. My skin went cold. I didn't have a gun, just a hatchet and a kitchen knife. I stood in the middle of the room, clutching the flashlight in one hand, hatchet in the other, trying to listen. The knocking stopped, then footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy. Whoever it was stood there for a long time. I didn't move. The door didn't rattle. No attempt to get in. Just that weight of presence. Eventually, the footsteps receded. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, shaking, until the first light broke through the trees. I left as soon as the sun was up, throwing my gear in the truck without breakfast. I didn't even lock the cabin. I just got in and drove, watching the tree line in the rearview mirror the entire time. I didn't report it to the police. What could I say? Someone scratched my cabin and knocked on my windows? There was no real crime, just a feeling, a presence. Predator circling, watching. A few days later, I got a call from the friend who owned the place. I asked him casually if anyone else had been out there recently. He said no, not since last winter. I didn't mention what happened. I just told him I left early, needed to get back to the city. It's been over 2 years, and I haven't gone back to any cabin since. I still think about that night, though. Sometimes I wake up at 2 a.m., heart racing, thinking I heard a tap on the window. I've changed apartments twice since then, and I keep a baseball bat near my bed. I don't think whoever it was wanted to hurt me, at least not that night. I think they just liked watching, waiting. Maybe they were planning something. Maybe they were testing how long I'd last. Maybe if I'd stayed one more night, they would have come inside. But I didn't stay, and I'll never go back to that cabin again. The cabin stood at the edge of the woods, far enough from the nearest town that the only sound you could hear for miles was the wind rustling the trees. The area was secluded, perfect for someone wanting to get away from the noise of everyday life. That's why I had chosen it. My name's Ethan, I'm 27, and I'd been planning this trip for months. I needed time to clear my head, and the cabin was the ideal spot. No distractions, no people, just nature and the stillness of the wilderness. It was the middle of autumn, the leaves in vibrant reds, oranges, and yellows carpeting the forest floor. The cool air was a welcome change from the city's constant buzz. I had rented the cabin online after seeing a few pictures. It looked small but charming, with a rough stone fireplace and wood paneling that gave it a cozy, rustic vibe. The reviews were mostly positive, though some mentioned the area being a little too isolated for comfort. But I wasn't worried. I was here to enjoy solitude, not be afraid of it. The drive to the cabin was long, about 4 hours, and as I turned off the main highway onto a narrow dirt road, the last of the city's lights faded away behind me. My car bounced over the uneven ground, the tires crunching over the gravel and leaves. Eventually, the road opened up to a clearing, and I saw the cabin in the distance, just as advertised, nestled between tall pine trees with a small porch and a chimney that would undoubtedly be smoking once I lit a fire. I parked in front of the cabin, the engine's low hum fading to silence as I stepped out of the car. The first thing that hit me was the quiet. It was absolute, unnerving almost. No birds chirped, no breeze rustled the trees, just stillness. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, I'd come here for peace and quiet, right? I grabbed my bags from the trunk and headed up the short path to the front door. The wood creaked under my boots as I stepped onto the porch. The cabin had that unmistakable scent of aged wood and earth, the kind you get when a place has been standing for decades. I unlocked the door and entered. Inside, it was just as cozy as I'd hoped. The living room had a large stone fireplace, with an old leather couch and a couple of mismatched chairs around it. A few shelves were lined with books, and the kitchen was small but fully functional. I smiled, setting my bags down on the couch. There was a sense of warmth here that I hadn't expected, probably from the cabin itself, but also from the idea of being so far removed from the usual stresses of life. I decided to explore a little. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, 1 small bathroom, and a small attic space that looked a bit dusty from the doorway. There were no modern amenities like Wi-Fi or television, but I didn't mind. The point of the trip was to disconnect, after all. I unpacked my things and then went outside to sit on the porch. The air was crisp, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. Felt good to be away from everything. As the night began to fall, I stoked up the fireplace, the sound of the logs crackling filling the quiet. The cabin started to feel like home. I heated up some canned soup on the stove and sat down to eat at the small wooden table. The warmth from the fire and the smell of the soup were comforting. The idea of being so far from civilization still hadn't fully sunk in, and yet, there was something about this place that felt different, something off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Later, I made myself comfortable on the couch with a book I'd brought along. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was quiet, too quiet. The stillness was becoming unsettling, and I found myself glancing out the windows every few minutes, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. But there was nothing, just the dark outline of the woods and the faint rustling of leaves. I shook the thought from my head, telling myself I was being ridiculous. I was here to relax, to get away from stress, not to let my imagination run wild. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke up once in the middle of the night, disoriented, hearing the wind picking up outside, but it was nothing more than a passing gust. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and fell back to sleep. The next day, I spent most of my time hiking through the woods, exploring the area around the cabin. The landscape was beautiful, with dense trees and winding trails. I followed a small creek for a while, the sound of the water rushing over the rocks soothing. It was peaceful, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe easily again. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I returned to the cabin. There was an odd stillness in the air, like the atmosphere had shifted. The wind had died down, and everything seemed too quiet. I brushed off the feeling, thinking it was just my nerves. I started another fire, the flames flickering and casting shadows across the room. I was just getting comfortable when I heard it. A soft thud, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. It was faint at first, but it repeated. Thud, thud, like something heavy was being dropped onto the ground. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, straining to listen. Another thud. This time it sounded closer. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and went to the window. I couldn't see anything, just the dark outline of the trees and the flickering light of the fire. My breath came a little faster, and I forced myself to take a deep breath, telling myself it was probably just a falling branch or an animal moving through the woods. But then I heard something else, a faint scraping noise, like nails dragging along wood. I froze, my mind racing. I didn't want to think it, but I couldn't help myself. What if someone was out there? What if someone had come to the cabin? I stood in place for a few minutes, straining to hear anything else. When I didn't hear anything for a while, I tried to calm myself. There was no sign of anyone. I was overthinking things. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The scraping sound didn't come back, but I couldn't ignore the unease settling in my chest. I spent the rest of the evening in the living room, keeping the fire going and sitting as close to the warmth as possible. I had a feeling that no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I wasn't going to get any sleep that night. By morning, I felt drained, the sense of unease still hanging over me like a cloud. I decided to spend the day inside, reading and staying near the fire. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every now and then, I would hear a noise from outside, the creaking of the porch, the rustle of leaves. But when I looked, there was nothing there. The longer I stayed, the more the cabin felt like a trap, the walls closing in on me. As the sun began to set, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here any longer. I packed up my things, my hands shaking as I threw my clothes into my bag. I wasn't going to risk being here another night, not with everything feeling so wrong. When I stepped outside, the wind had picked up again, the trees swaying and creaking in the growing darkness. I hurried to the car, my heart racing, trying not to look over my shoulder. I fumbled with the keys, feeling an overwhelming sense of urgency. Finally, I got the door open and jumped inside. The engine started, and I pulled out of the driveway, not even looking back. As I drove down the dirt road, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The cabin was behind me now, but the unease, the fear lingered. It wasn't until I was miles away, the lights of the nearest town starting to appear in the distance, that I finally felt like I could breathe again. I didn't know what had happened or why the cabin had felt so wrong, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I wasn't going back there, ever. It was late September when I decided to take a week off and head to the cabin, the one my uncle had left me in his will a couple of years ago. A small, rustic place in the woods, near a lake no one really went to. Perfect for getting away from everything, work, the city, people. I thought I could use the solitude. The stress had been building up for months, and I figured a week in nature, with no distractions, would clear my head. I had arrived late afternoon, the sun already dipping low behind the mountains. The cabin looked the same as I remembered it. Weathered wood, moss growing along the roofline, a small porch with an old rocking chair. It was simple, nothing fancy. My uncle had never been the type to care much about luxury. It wasn't even connected to electricity, and there was no running water. The essentials: a wood stove, a small fridge powered by gas, a bed, and a few old pieces of furniture. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth as I unloaded my things. I packed enough food for the week and a couple of books. It was the kind of place where you could just breathe if you didn't mind the quiet. And it was quiet, so quiet it felt as though the world outside the cabin had just stopped moving. That night, I made a fire in the stove and sat by it, watching the flames dance. I hadn't expected anything strange to happen, but there was this sense of unease I couldn't shake off. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a nervous energy that clung to the air. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're alone in a place that hasn't seen another soul in a while. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the sound of the fire crackling, the occasional howl of a distant wolf. The wind outside began picking up, howling through the trees, making the cabin creak. I had heard stories about the cabin, but they were nothing more than rumors. A few locals in the nearby town talked about strange happenings, but they all sounded like nonsense to me. People who didn't understand the wilderness always saw it as something eerie, something to be afraid of. I wasn't like that. I grew up camping, hiking, spending time in places just like this. So I dismissed the stories and tried to relax. But as I sat there in the dim light of the fire, I couldn't help but feel as though something was off. It was subtle at first, just a sense that I wasn't alone, even though I clearly was. I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, like someone walking through the forest. But when I looked out the window, all I saw was the dark outline of trees against the night sky. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. After all, animals roamed the woods. Deer, foxes, maybe a bear. Anything was possible, right? But then I heard it again. The faint sound of footsteps, closer this time. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, feeling foolish for letting my mind get the best of me. I swept the light across the yard, my heart pounding for no reason I could explain. The beam of light hit the trees, the dirt, the path leading down toward the lake, but there was nothing there. Just the wind, the trees rustling. No one else. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to ignore the creeping feeling in the pit of my stomach. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I had nothing to worry about. The woods had a way of playing tricks on your mind when you were alone in them for too long. The darkness had a weight to it, a stillness that made the smallest sounds seem louder than they really were. I couldn't shake the feeling, though, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see someone standing there. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing noises, little creaks and groans from the cabin, the wind pushing against the walls. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. Every time I closed my eyes, I would hear something outside, like twigs snapping underfoot or the faintest sound of someone moving around. But when I opened my eyes and looked outside, there was nothing, no one. The next morning, I was determined to push it all out of my head. It was just my nerves, I told myself. I had been cooped up in that cabin for too long. I needed to get outside, get some fresh air, and focus on something else. I packed a bag with a few snacks and my camera, hoping to take some photos of the landscape to pass the time. I hiked down the path leading to the lake, the crisp air filling my lungs. The forest was dense here, and the sun barely reached the ground through the thick canopy of trees. The lake was only a mile or so away, but by the time I reached it, I could tell something wasn't right. The water was still unnaturally so. There wasn't a ripple on the surface, and the trees surrounding the lake seemed to be watching. Their gnarled branches twisted in strange shapes, and the shadows they cast seemed to move in ways that didn't quite match the shifting light. I shook my head, trying to clear the image, and forced myself to walk closer to the water's edge. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shape half submerged in the water. A dark outline, something floating there, caught among the rocks. As I got closer, I realized what it was. A wooden boat, abandoned and old. The kind of boat that didn't belong on a lake like this. It looked like it had been there for years, maybe decades. It was filled with water, the wood rotting away at the edges. But what made it unsettling was the rusted metal chain draped across the front, tied to a large rock beneath the surface. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. My gut told me to turn around and go back to the cabin, but curiosity got the better of me. I waded into the water, feeling the cold seep through my boots, and tugged on the chain. It was heavy, much heavier than I expected. It wouldn't budge. I scanned the area, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the trees, but there was no one. The air was thick with silence, and the lake stretched out before me, unnervingly still. I didn't like it, I felt trapped in this moment, standing there with the boat, the chain, the oppressive silence pressing in on me. Without thinking, I turned around and started heading back to the cabin. My pace quickened, and the deeper I went into the woods, the more anxious I became. The feeling of being watched intensified. I couldn't shake the idea that I wasn't alone out here. Something was following me. I could hear the faint sound of twigs snapping behind me, a soft crunch of footsteps. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing. No one. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, my heart racing. It wasn't just the lake, it wasn't just the noises. It was everything. The stillness, the silence, the isolation. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stayed inside for the rest of the day, only stepping outside to gather wood for the stove. As the sun set, I felt the same creeping sense of dread return, but this time, I was ready for it. I was determined to stay calm. I needed to get a grip on myself. I couldn't let this place get to me. That night, I decided to take a walk around the cabin, flashlight in hand, just to reassure myself that everything was fine. But as I circled the cabin, I noticed something strange. The woodpile was disturbed, like someone had recently gone through it. The logs were scattered in a haphazard manner, as though someone had been looking for something. My heart sank. I checked the windows and doors again, making sure everything was locked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. And then, just as I was about to go back inside, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the shadows, just standing there watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My hand gripped the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white, but I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. Should I call for help? Should I confront whoever it was? The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, like a shadow in the trees. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I ran back inside, locking the door and bolting it shut. I sat by the stove for hours, too afraid to sleep. I couldn't explain what had just happened. It felt like I had been watched the whole time. But by who? There was no one else out here. The next morning, I woke up to silence. No footsteps, no rustling of leaves, no wind howling outside, just peace. I decided to leave. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been lurking in the shadows, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I packed up my things and drove back to town, the unease still heavy in my chest. But as I drove away, I realized something. I wasn't afraid of whatever was in the woods. I was afraid of what I had seen. The thing I couldn't explain. The thing that was still watching me, even as I left. I never went back to that cabin. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as I walked deeper into the forest, my boots crunching on the gravel path beneath me. I had never been to this part of the woods before. A small cabin stood nestled between towering trees, its wooden frame barely visible through the thick undergrowth. The year was 2023, and at 27 years old, I was far from inexperienced when it came to outdoor adventures. I had grown up camping and hiking, spending countless nights in tents and under the stars. But this cabin, perched on a remote hillside, seemed different. Something about it tugged at the back of my mind, though I couldn't place it. The plan was simple. I needed a weekend to escape, a weekend away from the constant noise of my daily life. Work, city traffic, social obligations, all of it. When I stumbled upon this cabin on an old camping website, I figured it would be perfect. A cozy little retreat in the middle of nowhere, far from any distractions. The owner had listed it as a rustic escape, something out of the ordinary, but the reviews were good, and I was all for a bit of quiet solitude. The cabin came into view as I rounded a bend in the path. It was smaller than I had expected, but charming. The wooden walls were weathered, the roof slanted steeply down to the sides, and the chimney poked out like a crooked finger against the gray sky. There were no other buildings in sight, no sign of other people for miles, just the deep forest surrounding it. I stepped up onto the porch, the wooden planks creaking under my weight, and turned the rusty doorknob. The cabin smelled of pine, old wood, and dust. It was as though it had been waiting for someone to come. A small wooden table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the room, a faded rug beneath it. The kitchen was to the right, with a cast iron stove and an old-fashioned sink. There was a tiny wood-burning stove in the corner, with a stack of firewood next to it. The furnishings were simple, nothing extravagant, but it felt homey in a way. I set my backpack down on one of the chairs and made my way to the window. From here, the view was spectacular. The forest stretched out for miles, and beyond that, jagged mountains rose, their peaks shrouded in mist. It was perfect, the kind of place I had been craving. I felt a sense of peace wash over me, the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders. I set about unpacking, organizing my things, making sure everything was in its place. I planned to stay here for 2 nights. I didn't intend to do much, just read, relax, and maybe do a little bit of hiking around the area. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned orange, I decided to take a walk around the cabin. The forest felt alive with the sounds of evening creatures, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, the occasional snap of a twig. But there was something else, a distant noise. It was faint at first, almost inaudible, but it was there. A low thudding sound, like something heavy hitting the ground. I stopped in my tracks, listening intently. The sound came again, and this time it was closer. I shook it off as a deer or some other forest animal, but the feeling of unease lingered. I had been in forests like this before, but never one so isolated. It was unsettling, in a way I couldn't fully explain. The cabin felt so distant from everything, like it was forgotten by the world, tucked away in the farthest reaches of the woods. I decided it was best to head back inside, where it felt safer. The moment I stepped back onto the porch, I heard the noise again. A sharp thud, then silence. It was coming from the woods, somewhere off to the left, just beyond the trees. I couldn't see anything, but I didn't want to go investigating, not when the forest was so thick and the darkness was creeping in. Inside the cabin, I stoked the fire, the warmth from the crackling logs filling the room. I made a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the night settle in. The silence outside seemed to grow deeper, and that's when I noticed it. The wind had stopped. No rustling leaves, no creaking branches, just a stillness that felt almost unnatural. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. That night, I slept fitfully. The bed was comfortable enough, but every creak of the house, every snap of wood in the fire, kept me awake. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate steps that moved around the cabin. My heart raced, but when I peeked out the window, I saw nothing but darkness and the outline of trees. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I woke early and made breakfast, determined to enjoy my time here. I headed out for a hike up the nearby hill, eager to explore the area. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, the trees tall and imposing, their trunks covered in moss. The sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled light on the ground. I tried to focus on the beauty of it all, but the sense of being watched lingered, just at the edge of my awareness. It wasn't until I reached the top of the hill that I found it. An old, rusted hunting stand, its metal frame half hidden by overgrown vines and branches. I approached cautiously, peering up through the gaps in the trees. It looked ancient, as if no one had used it in years. The wood was rotting, the metal oxidized. But what caught my eye was something unexpected. A small pile of what appeared to be animal bones scattered near the base of the stand. I crouched down to examine them. The bones were bleached white, old and brittle, as though they had been there for a long time. There was no sign of any recent animal remains, just these bones, lying in the dirt. A chill ran down my spine. Why would someone leave bones here, in the middle of the woods, far from any other human presence? My mind began to race, but I forced myself to leave the hunting stand behind and head back to the cabin. The afternoon passed without incident, and I began to feel a sense of calm returning to my body. I made dinner, read for a while, and then went to bed, But once again, sleep eluded me. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence of the cabin. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, and I thought I heard something scratching at the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there. It was just after midnight when I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening. The noise came from outside, a heavy thud against the cabin wall. I grabbed the flashlight from the table beside the bed and crept toward the window. I could see nothing in the darkness beyond the glass, but I heard it again. Thud, thud, thud. My pulse raced. I had no idea what it was, but it was definitely coming from the direction of the woods, just beyond the porch. For a moment, I considered packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to overreact. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. Maybe a bear or something large hitting the cabin out of curiosity. But there was an instinct inside me telling me to stay quiet, to stay still. I sat up, listening. The thudding continued for what felt like an eternity, then suddenly stopped. Complete silence returned, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But that wasn't the end of it. A new sound filled the air, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching over the gravel path. They stopped at the porch, and I held my breath, my hands trembling. Whoever or whatever was out there was close now. I could hear them shifting, moving, and then a soft knocking sound on the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I was paralyzed with fear. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The porch was quiet again, and the air felt thick with tension. I waited for what seemed like hours, but nothing happened. I had no idea if whoever had been out there was still around. I couldn't even bring myself to check the door. The thought of opening it and finding something out there in the dark made my blood run cold. By morning, I was exhausted. My nerves were frayed, my sleep disturbed by the events of the night. I knew I couldn't stay any longer, not after what had happened. I packed my things quickly, making sure I didn't forget anything. As I walked out the door and down the porch steps, I glanced at the woods one last time. The silence was back, but it was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It felt ominous, like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't look back as I left the cabin behind, walking quickly down the path that would take me back to my car. The drive home felt longer than it had any right to be, the road stretching out in front of me as if I were being pulled away from something I couldn't fully understand. As I turned the corner and the cabin disappeared from view, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly escaped something. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I'd never go back there. And for the first time in a long while, I was glad to be home. I was 34 the year I decided to get out of Atlanta for a while. It was late September 2017. Things in my life were tight, too tight, between the noise of the city, the tension at work, and the slow unraveling of what used to be a decent relationship. I felt like something inside me was close to snapping. I just needed quiet, real quiet, somewhere I could shut the world out for a while and try to remember who I was when I wasn't constantly surrounded by other people's noise. I found a listing for a cabin up in northern Idaho. A buddy of mine had gone up that way a few years back and told me it was the kind of place where you could walk a mile in any direction and not see another soul. That's what I was looking for. The cabin was small and old, but it looked solid. The pictures showed a wood stove, a simple bed, a work table, and a narrow kitchen. No internet, no cell service, just forest in every direction. It was owned by an older guy who lived out in Coeur d'Alene. He rented it out to hunters during the fall but had an open 2-week window between bookings. I took it. It took almost a full day to drive out there. The last 15 miles were on a dirt road that twisted up into the mountains and didn't have any signage. I used printed directions and a compass just to find the turnoff. It was nearly dark when I pulled up. The place was tucked back into a clearing surrounded by thick pine forest. There was no electricity, just a small generator in the shed out back, which I fired up to check the lights. Everything worked. I brought in my supplies, mostly canned food, bottled water, and some tools, and locked the truck. I left the generator off after the first test. I wanted quiet, The first few days were exactly what I needed. I got up with the sun, chopped some firewood, cooked simple meals, and just sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, staring into the trees. At night, I'd light the stove, read a little by flashlight, and fall asleep to the sound of wind sliding through the trees. I hadn't felt that peaceful in years, but things started to shift on the fourth night. It started with small things. I woke up around 2 in the morning needing to use the bathroom, which was just a short walk into the trees out back, and I noticed that the wind had completely stopped. Not a breeze, dead silent. That's not all that unusual, but it gave the woods this strange, thick feeling, like everything was holding its breath. I stepped outside with my flashlight and walked out behind the cabin. As I passed the shed, I noticed something on the ground next to it. At first I thought it was one of the buckets I'd used to bring in water, but when I looked closer, it was a dead bird. A big one, some kind of hawk or falcon. Its wings were folded tight, and there was no sign of blood or wounds, just dead, lying flat on the dirt. I didn't touch it, I just kept walking. But the whole time I was doing my business out there, I kept thinking about that bird. I'd seen hawks before, even roadkill, but something about this one felt placed. Like it hadn't just died there, like it had been set down. When I came back inside, I locked the door for the first time since arriving. The next day was cloudy and colder. I kept busy, mostly clearing brush around the cabin and organizing some of the firewood. But by afternoon, I noticed another thing that bothered me. I had stacked about a dozen logs next to the front porch the day before. Now, 2 of them were missing. That wouldn't have been strange if I'd used them, but I hadn't. I'd only used what I brought inside on the first day. I checked around the porch thinking maybe they rolled or I stacked them wrong, but they were just gone. The thing is, it's not like someone could have just wandered up and taken them. You don't end up at this cabin by accident. The nearest neighbor was probably 5 or 6 miles away, and I would have heard a vehicle or seen fresh tire tracks on the dirt. But the ground was undisturbed. No tracks, just 2 logs gone from a neat stack. I told myself it could have been animals, maybe some larger scavenger that I didn't know about up there, but I knew it didn't make sense. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds in the woods. Not animals exactly, just sharp, short noises, like something heavy stepping once or twice, then stopping. I'd get up, shine my flashlight through the windows, and see nothing. But the feeling was there. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. Felt like something waiting. On the 6th day, I decided I needed to check the perimeter. I'm not a paranoid person, but I've spent enough time outdoors to know when something isn't right. I grabbed my small axe, just for comfort, and walked a wide circle around the cabin, staying within about 100 yards. I looked for anything, footprints, markings, broken branches, but the forest was normal. Too normal. If anything had been out there, it was careful. I spent most of the day inside after that, just sitting at the table, listening. I started writing in a little notebook I'd brought, just to keep track of what was happening. Something about putting it on paper made it feel more manageable. But that night, everything escalated. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of something scraping across the porch. Not fast, slow. Something heavy being dragged or pulled. I sat up in bed and held my breath. The sound stopped. Then I heard 3 distinct thumps on the front wall of the cabin. Not loud, just deliberate, like someone tapping with their knuckles. I stayed in bed until the sun came up. When I finally got the courage to go outside, I found something that made my stomach drop. The logs I'd stacked earlier in the week. 3 more were now missing, and the ones that were left weren't in a neat pile anymore. They were scattered across the porch, as if someone had tossed them around while looking for something. There were no tracks, no signs of animals, but there were thin scratches on the wooden deck. Parallel lines like something had been dragged back and forth. That morning, I packed my bag. I planned to leave the next day at first light. I didn't want to be out there at night again, but I wasn't thinking clearly. I left the generator on for the first time in days, hoping the light would somehow make me feel safer. I cooked a quick dinner and sat in the kitchen with the axe in my lap. I couldn't read, couldn't write, just sat there, heart pounding, watching the windows. Around midnight, the generator sputtered and cut off. I waited, hoping it was just a fuel issue, but it didn't come back on. That's when I heard the back door handle rattle. The cabin only had 2 doors, front and back. I had locked them both. The rattle was slow at first, like someone testing it. Then it got more forceful. I stood up and moved toward the door, gripping the axe with both hands. I didn't turn on the flashlight. I didn't want whoever was out there to know where I was inside. The handle stopped moving after about 30 seconds. Then silence. I stood there in the dark for what felt like hours. When the sky finally began to lighten, I opened the back door and stepped outside. Nothing. No one. But down near the base of the shed, I saw something new. It was the dead hawk again, or maybe a different one, laid out in the exact same spot, wings folded, eyes open. I didn't touch it. I just walked straight to the truck and started it up. The road out was rougher than I remembered. I drove faster than I should have, jolting over rocks and sliding on loose gravel. I didn't care. I kept checking the rearview mirror every few minutes, but nothing followed. When I finally got back to Coeur d'Alene, I didn't stop until I was in a parking lot near a grocery store with people walking around and the sound of traffic in the distance. I just sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at nothing. I never told the owner what happened. I just left the keys in his mailbox and drove back to Atlanta the next day. It's been years since then, and I still don't have an explanation. Maybe someone else was using that cabin without the owner knowing. Maybe it was some kind of sick game or warning. Maybe I was being watched from the moment I got there. I don't know. All I know is I've never felt anything like that again. Not fear, not quiet, not the way the air felt when everything in the woods seemed to stop breathing at once. And I haven't gone back into the mountains since. I wasn't the kind of person who usually went out to the woods alone. My friends often joked about my nervousness when it came to being in the middle of nowhere, but after weeks of pressure from them, I finally agreed to spend a weekend alone in a cabin in the woods. It seemed harmless enough, a quiet break away from work, a little peace and solitude. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, off the grid, just the way the owners liked it. It sounded like an escape, and at first, that's all I wanted. I had just turned 29. I had a decent job, a few friends, and a lot of stress that needed to be shaken off. It was late October, just before the snow would start to fall, and the chill in the air had already begun. My car pulled into the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, its tires crunching over the dry, brittle leaves. Trees lined both sides of the road, their trunks dark and twisted, reaching up into the sky like skeletal hands. A cold wind rustled through the branches, sending a shiver down my spine. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, feeling a little uneasy, but that was normal, right? I'd rented the cabin through a small, local agency. The ad had been vague, only offering the basics: a small, one-bedroom cabin with a fireplace, a view of a nearby lake, and no other houses for miles. No neighbors, no distractions, just peace. The perfect retreat. As I parked and grabbed my bags from the back of the car, I noticed how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that seems almost unnatural. The kind that makes you realize how much noise is around you all the time, even when you're not paying attention. There were no birds chirping, no sounds of traffic, just an almost suffocating silence. I locked the car, grabbed the key from under the mat, and made my way to the front door of the cabin. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the wood cold under my hand. Inside, the place was exactly as I'd expected, rustic but comfortable. A large stone fireplace sat in the center of the living room, with a small couch and a few wooden chairs scattered around. The wooden floors creaked beneath my feet, and the scent of pine and old wood filled the air. The windows overlooked a small, mist-covered lake, the surface of the water smooth and glassy, reflecting the gray sky above. A chill seemed to settle in the room as I took a deep breath. This place was going to be great, I thought, just what I needed. I unpacked my bags and started a fire in the hearth. The flames flickered and crackled as I sat down in the armchair, settling in for a night of reading and relaxation. The hours passed slowly, and by the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, the only light in the cabin came from the fire and a single dim lamp near the door. Outside, the wind had picked up, and I could hear the branches scratching against the walls of the cabin, making the house feel even more isolated. Around midnight, I heard a noise, a faint scraping sound, like something dragging along the ground. It wasn't a loud noise, just a soft, unsettling sound, but it was enough to make me pause. I sat up straight, listening carefully. The fire popped and crackled in the hearth, the only other sound in the room. I waited, holding my breath, but there was nothing else. Maybe it was just the wind, I thought, or maybe an animal outside. I shrugged it off and went back to my book, but the uneasy feeling lingered. An hour later, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, closer, like something was definitely moving outside. The sound was slow, deliberate, like footsteps dragging through the leaves. I stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The mist had thickened, and the lake was barely visible now, shrouded in fog. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with the weight of the wind. I didn't see anything moving, but the sense of being watched crept up my spine. I backed away from the window and walked over to the door. It was locked, the deadbolt securely in place. I could feel my pulse quickening as the silence settled in again. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or some other animal had wandered too close to the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to check the windows again, but this time, I heard a loud thud. Came from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat. The thud was heavy, like something large had bumped into the side of the house. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and moved cautiously toward the back door. I shined the light through the window, scanning the dark yard behind the cabin. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, just outside the pool of light from the cabin. It was hard to make out, just a shadowy shape against the trees, but there was no mistaking the feeling of being watched. My mind raced. Was it a person? A man? I had to be imagining it, right? Maybe it was just a trick of the light or the trees playing games with my eyes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing. I had come here to get away from everything, but now all I wanted was to leave. I grabbed my coat and ran for the door, but as I reached for the handle, a loud bang echoed from the back of the cabin. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone had just hit the wall. I froze. What the hell was going on? I turned, my eyes scanning the room for anything I could use as a weapon. The fireplace poker. I grabbed it and held it tight, my hand shaking. There was no way I was going outside to confront whoever or whatever was out there. The banging came again, louder this time, and I could feel the walls of the cabin shaking from the force of it. It sounded like someone was trying to break in. I moved back to the window and looked out, but there was no one there. The figure had disappeared, but the noise continued. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. The hours dragged on, but the banging didn't stop. Came in waves, each one more frantic than the last. I was trapped, my only thought now being how to survive the night. I wasn't sure if I could even make it until morning. I was 32 when I decided to take some time off and head up north to a cabin near the edge of Lake McCulloch in northern Minnesota. It was 2021, early October, and the leaves had already started turning. I'd been working long hours in a warehouse down in Iowa City, and I needed a break from the constant noise, the forklifts, the talking, the same metal doors opening and closing every day. A friend of mine from college, Mike, had inherited a small cabin from his uncle who passed away 2 years earlier. He'd barely used it and told me I could stay there for a couple of weeks if I wanted. I jumped on it. The drive took me most of the day. I left around 6 a.m. and got there just after 4 p.m. The road turned to gravel for the last 30 minutes, then narrowed down into what felt like an old logging trail. Trees pressed in from both sides. I had no cell signal, and the GPS on my dashboard screen blinked out about 10 minutes before I arrived. I wasn't worried though. I'd printed directions like people used to do just in case. The sky was clouded over, and there was a heavy stillness in the air as I pulled up to the cabin. The place was simple. One story, wood-paneled, with a wide porch and a view of the lake through the trees. The nearest neighbor was apparently a mile or two down the dirt road. The cabin sat a few dozen yards back from the shoreline, with a narrow trail leading from the porch down to a wooden dock that stuck out into the water. The lake was perfectly still, black in the late afternoon light, with a thin mist hovering just above the surface. I got out and stretched. The air smelled like wet leaves and pine needles. There were 2 steps leading up to the porch, and I noticed that the wood creaked a little when I walked across it. The key had been left under a loose board beside the door, just like Mike said. I opened up and stepped into a room that smelled like dust, wood, and something faintly musty, like old furniture that hadn't been touched in months. Inside, it was all wood paneling and dark green carpet. There was a small couch facing a stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, and a compact kitchen against the back wall. A hallway led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, not even a radio. Just a stack of old magazines, some board games, and a couple of paperbacks in a basket beside the fireplace. It was exactly what I needed. That first night was quiet. I heated up a can of soup on the gas stove, cracked open a beer I brought with me, and sat on the porch listening to the breeze rustling through the trees. There were no city sounds, no traffic, just the occasional splash from the lake and the distant hoot of an owl. I slept like a rock. The next morning, I went for a walk around the area. The land behind the cabin sloped gently upward into a thick forest. I followed a narrow trail that looked like deer had been using it. It twisted and turned, gradually leading me uphill. After about an hour, I came across what looked like the remains of an old shed or shack, collapsed in on itself and covered in moss. There was rusted metal sticking out of the leaves, maybe old tools or farm equipment. I poked around a bit but didn't go inside. It didn't feel right. I turned around and headed back. That afternoon, I decided to go fishing off the dock. I'd brought a cheap rod and some basic gear, and I had a small cooler with me. The lake was still quiet, though I thought I saw movement across the water once or twice. Ripples that didn't look like fish. At one point, I thought I saw a canoe or kayak drifting between the trees on the far side. But when I looked again, there was nothing. I chalked it up to shadows or my eyes playing tricks. The fish weren't biting much, but I didn't care. I wasn't really there to catch anything. I just liked sitting out over the water with the smell of the lake and the cool breeze on my face. I stayed until the sun dipped below the trees and the temperature dropped. As I packed up my gear and walked back up the path to the cabin, I had a strange feeling that someone was watching me from the woods. I stopped and turned, scanning the trees, but I didn't see anyone, just shadows and branches swaying. Back inside, I locked the door, made some scrambled eggs and toast, and read a few chapters from an old detective novel I found in the basket. At some point, I must have fallen asleep with the book on my chest because I woke up at around 2 a.m. The fire had gone out, and it was freezing. I got up to throw another log in the fireplace and noticed the back door. The one in the kitchen that led out to the side yard was open just a crack. I didn't remember leaving it open. I stared at it for a few seconds before walking over and pulling it shut. I locked the deadbolt and then pushed a chair under the doorknob. Not because I really thought someone was out there, but because it made me feel a little better. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I looked for tracks or signs that someone had been near the cabin. The ground was damp from rain a few days earlier, so I figured it would be easy to spot prints, but I didn't see anything. No footprints, no bike or ATV tracks, nothing. I figured I'd just forgotten to close it tight. Maybe a breeze pushed it open. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods felt heavier, like they were watching me back now. I went for a shorter walk that day, didn't go too far. Just stuck to the clearing around the cabin and chopped some firewood. I kept checking behind me like I expected someone to be there. That evening, I heard something out in the woods. Not an animal. It was more rhythmic. Heavy footsteps, slowly circling around the cabin from a distance. I killed the lights and stood by the window listening. Whatever it was stayed just out of sight, but I heard it moving through the leaves. Circled once, twice, then stopped. I stood there for almost 30 minutes in the dark before I finally moved away from the window. I didn't sleep that night, I sat in the dark with a flashlight in one hand and a fire poker in the other. Every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard breathing outside the window, just low and steady, like someone standing just under the sill. I didn't look. In the morning, I went outside with a kitchen knife in my hand. I walked the perimeter of the cabin and found a pile of stacked rocks right outside the back window. 5 of them, neatly arranged from largest to smallest. They hadn't been there the day before. I went back inside and started packing. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. It's hard to explain. I felt like if I ran, I'd be admitting something was really wrong, like I'd lose some kind of control. So I decided I'd leave the next day, just one day early, pack up and drive back in the morning. That was a mistake. That night, I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time. They weren't trying to hide. They circled the cabin twice, then stopped at the front porch. The boards creaked. I was in the bedroom with the door locked. I had pushed the dresser in front of it, which didn't do much, but again, it made me feel better. I heard the front door handle jiggle once, twice, then nothing. Total silence for what felt like hours. I didn't move, didn't sleep, just sat there holding the fire poker and waiting for something to happen. Then, around dawn, I heard footsteps walking away, slowly, not rushed. When the sun finally came up, I went out. I was done. I tossed everything into the back of my car and didn't even bother with breakfast. As I pulled out onto the gravel road, I noticed something nailed to a tree about 50 yards from the driveway. I stopped the car and walked over to it. It was a photo, an old Polaroid, weathered and damp around the edges, pinned to the bark with a rusted nail. It showed the cabin, taken from the tree line at night. Lights on inside. Someone standing at the window. Me. I left it there. I drove the full 8 hours back without stopping once. No gas, no food, nothing. I made it home just before dark and didn't tell anyone what happened for a long time. Later, I asked Mike if his uncle ever talked about the cabin, if he'd had any weird experiences. Mike just shrugged and said the guy never went up there much. Too remote, he said. Too quiet. I haven't gone back, and I never will. It was late October of 2018 when I decided to take a break from work and spend some time in the woods. I was 34 then, single, working as a freelance graphic designer in Chicago. I had been burned out from nonstop deadlines and screen time. A friend had told me about this quiet area in northern Minnesota, somewhere near Ely, where he used to go fishing as a kid. There was a cabin there his uncle once owned, but it had been empty for years. He said it was old, no electricity, no running water, but still solid. I could use it for free if I wanted. It sounded perfect to me. I packed up my old SUV with what I thought I'd need. A couple coolers of food, a camping stove, sleeping bag, lanterns, batteries, clothes for cold weather, and some books. I also brought a hatchet and a folding saw in case I needed to chop firewood. It was supposed to be cold that week, dropping into the 30s at night. I printed directions and loaded my phone with maps in case I lost signal, which I expected to happen once I was deep into the woods. The drive was long, nearly 10 hours from the city. The further north I went, the more remote things got. Gas stations became rare. Towns got smaller. By the time I passed through Ely, the last town on the route, it was early afternoon. The road turned to gravel not long after, winding through thick pine and birch forest. I followed the directions carefully. At one point, I had to leave the main road entirely and follow an unmarked dirt trail. It was barely wide enough for my vehicle, and the trees scratched against the sides of the car as I crept along. Eventually, I came to a clearing where the cabin sat just like he'd described. It was old, with gray, weather-beaten wood and a sagging metal roof. The windows were covered in grime, but intact. The door stuck when I tried to open it, but I shoved it hard and it gave. Inside, it was one room with a small wood stove, a dusty old cot, some shelves, and a table with 2 chairs. Rodent droppings were in the corners, and there was a musky smell, but it was solid and dry. I opened all the windows to air it out. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning. I swept out the dirt and leaves, knocked down cobwebs, and wiped off the surfaces. I checked for leaks or rot and didn't see any. There was a pile of chopped wood outside, dry under a makeshift lean-to. I brought some in and lit a fire in the stove before the sun went down. It got dark fast out there. There was no light pollution, just blackness beyond the windows and the sound of wind moving through the trees. The first night was uneventful. I read by lantern light until I got tired, then crawled into my sleeping bag on the cot. The silence was overwhelming. In the city, there's always some background noise, cars, sirens, people. Here, it was just the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I drifted off after a while, but woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange sound. It was like a slow dragging or scraping noise coming from outside. I sat up and listened. It stopped. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer walking through the brush. After a few minutes, I laid back down and forced myself to sleep. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail leading away from the clearing, barely visible under the fallen leaves. I followed it for a while and found a small frozen-over pond about half a mile in. There were no footprints or signs of people, just quiet woods and the sound of distant birds. Felt peaceful. That afternoon, I collected more wood, boiled water from a nearby stream for drinking, and cooked a simple meal on the camping stove. I had brought a small solar battery for my phone, but I kept it off most of the time to conserve power. There was no signal anyway. I read a bit, jotted down some sketches, and sat outside with a blanket wrapped around me until it got too cold. Again, I built up the fire before bed. That second night, I heard the noise again, scraping, slow, like something being dragged across the ground. Came from the left side of the cabin this time. I turned off the lantern and stood by the window, peeking through a small gap in the curtain. I couldn't see anything. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound stopped again after a few minutes. I told myself it had to be a raccoon or porcupine. Maybe a branch had fallen. But I noticed something in the morning, tracks. Not paw prints, but drag marks. 2 of them parallel, starting at the tree line and ending near the cabin wall. Then they just stopped. I went out to look closer. The ground was covered in leaves, but I could tell something had been pulled or dragged through them. I looked around but didn't find anything. No animal, no object, no broken branches. I brushed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The third night, I decided to stay up late and keep watch. I sat by the window with the lantern turned low, wrapped in a blanket, listening. For hours, nothing happened. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. That dragging sound, slow and steady, from the back side of the cabin. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the back door quietly. I stepped out onto the cold porch, heart pounding. I moved the light slowly across the trees. Nothing. I walked a few steps toward the woods. Still nothing. But the dragging had stopped the moment I opened the door. I stood there for a long time, just listening. Eventually, I went back inside. When I woke up in the morning, there were new drag marks on the other side of the cabin, same parallel lines, same end point. It was like someone or something was circling the place at night. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to. I hadn't seen anything. Could still be an animal. Maybe a bear dragging a carcass. Maybe an old trap or cable had gotten pulled by wind. I didn't want to panic over nothing. That day, I explored further down the trail near the pond. I figured it would help clear my head. The sky was overcast and the air felt damp. After about a mile, I found something I hadn't seen before. A second cabin, older and smaller than mine. It was half collapsed, covered in vines and moss. The door hung open and one wall had caved in. It looked abandoned for decades. Inside, there were rusted tools, broken furniture, and a shattered mirror. Something about it felt off. The place was hidden like someone had built it to disappear. I didn't stay long. On the way back, I kept looking over my shoulder. That night, I placed small sticks upright around the cabin walls, spaced out in a circle. If anything came close, it would knock them over. I also brought the hatchet inside and kept it next to the cot. The fire burned hot, but I didn't sleep much. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard the dragging again. I held my breath and listened. This time, it moved around the cabin slowly, like something circling deliberately. After about 20 minutes, it stopped. I didn't dare go outside. In the morning, some of the sticks were knocked over on the east side. The drag marks were there again. And this time, I noticed something else. A small pile of rocks stacked neatly next to the wall, like someone had left them there intentionally. That was it. I decided I was leaving the next morning. I spent the rest of that day packing up. I left the place as clean as I could. I tried not to think about the other cabin, or the noises, or the drag marks. That night, I kept the fire going and stayed fully dressed in case I had to leave suddenly. I barely slept. Around 4 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the wall. Not scratching or dragging, tapping. Rhythmic like a knock. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then again. I sat up and listened, too afraid to move. Then silence. I stayed like that until sunrise. When it was light enough, I loaded the last of my things into the car and left. The road out felt narrower than before. Every sound in the woods made me flinch. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, and even then I didn't breathe easy until I reached Ely. Back in Chicago, I tried to make sense of what happened. I looked at maps, tried to find that second cabin on satellite view, but nothing showed up. I didn't tell anyone about the drag marks or the knocks. I just said the place was too remote and I needed a hot shower. It's been years now, and I still think about that trip. I still don't know what was out there. Maybe it was a person living off-grid, maybe it was a hunter or some reclusive squatter. But it wasn't random. The drag marks, the sticks, the rocks, they were placed on purpose. Someone was watching the cabin at night. Maybe they were trying to scare me off. If that was their goal, it worked. I've never gone back, and I don't plan to. I still love the woods, but I stick to campgrounds now. Places with other people around, lights, even security cameras. I learned something out there in Minnesota. The scariest things aren't always loud or violent. Sometimes, it's what stays quiet, just outside the window, waiting for you to fall asleep. I took a week off in late October 2023, hoping to finally disconnect from everything. No phone, no internet, no emails, no people. I had been working 12-hour days as a paramedic in Cleveland, and after a rough year filled with too many night shifts, I needed to get away from sirens and concrete. I found a small off-grid cabin in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, about 30 minutes west of Iron River. I booked it online through a private owner's site. The photos showed a modest wooden cabin surrounded by dense forest, with a small lake about 50 yards out front. No neighbors, no roads nearby, just a gravel path that stopped half a mile away, where you had to park and walk in. I packed light, mostly dried food, bottled water, a camping stove, extra clothes, a first aid kit, and a hunting knife I always took when heading into the woods. The cabin supposedly had solar panels, a wood stove, and a water pump, but I didn't want to rely on them too much. I brought my own sleeping bag, even though there was a bed there. I trusted my gear more than I trusted a mattress in some forgotten cabin. It took me about 10 hours to get there from Cleveland. The drive was long, but the roads were empty after I passed through Wisconsin. Once I crossed into the Upper Peninsula, things got quiet. The land was flat at first, then started to roll into slow hills covered in brown, gold, and red trees. By the time I got to the gravel path that led toward the cabin, the sun was low and orange, the light bleeding through the branches in long slants. I parked at the spot the owner had marked on the map and double-checked the coordinates before grabbing my pack. The walk-in was peaceful. A narrow trail wound through a tunnel of tall pines and yellow-leafed birches. I could hear the wind blowing loose leaves across the forest floor and squirrels rustling somewhere to the right. No other sounds, no birds even. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. The cabin finally came into view around a bend in the path. Small, square, and dark brown, with a tin roof that looked newer than the rest of the place. There was a single window in front and a little porch with a rocking chair and a rusted lantern hanging from a hook above the door. I checked the door, unlocked as expected. Inside, it was musty but clean. A small kitchen with a gas stove and a sink with a hand pump, a wood stove in the corner, and a single room with a bed, a shelf of old books, and a table with 2 chairs. There was also a battery-powered lantern on the shelf. No power outlets, no cell reception, just what I wanted. I set up quickly, got the wood stove going, and made a simple meal of rice and jerky on my little burner. That first night, I sat out on the porch in the cold, bundled up in a coat, watching the stars and listening to the sounds of the woods. I couldn't hear anything unnatural, just the occasional cracking of tree limbs or scurrying animals. It was peaceful. I slept well that night. The next morning, I woke up early. Light poured in through the window, filtered and pale. I stepped outside and took in the view of the lake. It wasn't big, maybe 100 yards across, but it was still. I saw no fish jumping, no birds gliding over it, just that calm, glassy surface. I walked around the edge, looking for a good spot to sit and maybe fish later if I found a stick to use as a rod. That's when I saw something odd. A small, blackened patch of earth near the tree line behind the cabin. It looked like someone had made a fire there, but it wasn't recent. The ground was scorched and surrounded by a ring of stones, but the ashes were scattered and wet. Maybe someone had camped here before. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured other hikers or hunters had stayed in the area. I walked farther into the trees, exploring for an hour or so, and found some broken branches stacked in a strange pattern against a tree. Not quite a shelter, not quite natural. Like someone had tried to build something but gave up. Again, I didn't dwell on it. People did weird things in the woods. I gathered some firewood and headed back. That night, things felt a little different. The wind picked up and the trees creaked. I thought I saw a flicker of light across the lake, deep in the woods, but when I looked again, it was gone. Could have been moonlight bouncing off something. I forced myself not to get paranoid. I made dinner, read a chapter of an old novel from the shelf, and went to sleep. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. Not a loud one, just a soft crunch outside, like someone stepping slowly on leaves. I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening. Then nothing. No wind, no animals. I stayed like that for a while, staring up at the wooden ceiling in the dark, feeling my breath tighten. After about 30 minutes of silence, I told myself it was a deer or raccoon, and I eventually fell back asleep. The next day, I went out to check around the cabin. I didn't find anything. No prints, no marks on the door, nothing disturbed. But I did notice something new out by the old fire ring I'd seen the day before. Someone had placed a stack of stones there. 5 rocks, balanced carefully on top of each other, forming a little tower about a foot tall. I hadn't seen it the day before. It hadn't rained overnight, so I knew I would have noticed it. It wasn't there, and now it was. I walked up and knocked it over. I didn't like the feeling it gave me. It wasn't art. It didn't look playful. It felt like a signal or a message. I circled the cabin one more time, checked the windows and door, then decided I'd hike out the next morning if anything else seemed off. I still had 4 more days booked, but the unease was building fast. That night was colder. I kept the stove burning and slept in my clothes. I left my hunting knife next to the sleeping bag. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard something. A tap on the wall, a creak on the porch, a distant crack in the woods. At one point, I heard the sound of water, like a foot stepping into the lake. I got up, turned on the lantern, and stared out the window, but everything was still. I didn't see anything. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and everything outside looked like a black wall. In the morning, I found boot prints on the porch. Clear ones, fresh, a size or 2 larger than mine. They came from the woods, stopped at the door, then turned around. I grabbed my gear, packed everything in under 10 minutes, and started walking back to the car. I didn't care if I had to sleep in it the rest of the trip. I just needed to get out of the woods. But the path back was wrong. I followed the trail, the same one I'd used 3 days earlier, but after half an hour of walking, I came back to the lake. The same lake, same cabin, same scorched fire ring. I had walked in a circle. That had never happened to me before. I was good with direction. I always kept track, but somehow I had ended up back where I started. I tried again, heading a different way, using the sun to guide me, but the trees looked identical in every direction. I couldn't find the gravel road or the marker tree I'd noted on the first day. I wandered for 3 more hours before finally giving up and returning to the cabin. I didn't want to be in the woods after dark without shelter. I was shaken. I knew something was wrong, either with me or with someone else in those woods. I didn't eat that night. I just locked the door, shoved a chair under the knob, and sat up with the knife in my lap and the lantern beside me. At around 2 in the morning, I heard movement on the porch. Slow steps. Then I heard the sound of something being placed against the door. Then silence. I waited until daylight. When I finally opened the door, I found another stack of stones. Taller this time. 7 rocks, balanced with care. I snapped. I grabbed the rocks and threw them into the woods as hard as I could. Then I grabbed my pack and set out again. This time heading directly east with the sun on my left, determined not to stop until I hit a road or cleared the forest. I walked for 6 hours straight without stopping. No path, just pushing through brush and trees. Eventually, I saw a power line cutting through the trees and followed it. After another 2 miles, I reached a rural highway. A passing pickup truck stopped when they saw me stumbling out of the woods covered in scratches and mud. I didn't explain much, just asked for a ride into town. That was 6 months ago. I never reported it to the local police. I didn't want to deal with questions I couldn't answer. I didn't take photos. I didn't grab evidence. I just left. I canceled my booking and never looked back. But sometimes I still think about the footprints, the stacks of rocks, the feeling of being watched. Someone was out there, maybe living off-grid, maybe playing games with anyone who came too close. I don't know. What I do know is this. If you ever see a cabin with no neighbors, no road, and a fire ring that looks used but wrong, leave. Don't stay. Don't wait for a second sign. Just turn around and go. I still hike. I still love the woods. But now I only go where other people go. I stay near trails, parks, and campsites. I don't go off-grid anymore. Not after that. It wasn't ghosts or monsters or anything out of a horror movie. It was just something real, something human, and that's what makes it worse. It was late October 2018 when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin I had rented through a small website run by a retired couple in Vermont. The place wasn't listed on any of the big rental sites, which was part of what drew me to it. It felt personal, quiet, disconnected from everything. I was 34 at the time, living in a noisy apartment in New Jersey, stuck in a dull IT job, tired of the same honking, flickering lights, and staring at glowing screens every day. I hadn't taken real time off in almost 2 years. I needed silence, woods, and fresh air more than I needed anything else. I thought a cabin in the middle of the Vermont woods would be exactly that. The drive took almost 6 hours. I didn't mind. I left before dawn, stopping for gas and coffee halfway through. By the time I reached the dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting orange light across the landscape. The trees were bright with color, deep red, burnt orange, golden yellow, like the kind you only see in travel magazines. The road twisted uphill, narrowing with every turn, until finally the trees opened just enough to reveal a 1-story wooden cabin with a pitched roof, a small porch, and smoke curling lazily from a stone chimney. The key had been left under a flat rock beside the steps, just like the owner said. Inside, the place was small but solid, clean, cozy in a very basic way. There was a wood stove in the main room, a single bed against one wall, a kitchen with an old but working stove and sink, and a small bathroom in the back with a cracked mirror and one of those old toilets with a pull chain. A large window over the sink looked out into the woods. There was no TV, no internet, no radio. My phone dropped signal about 15 minutes before I even got to the road leading here. That was fine with me. That was the point. I unpacked my bag, stored a week's worth of canned goods, pasta, water bottles, and dry snacks in the small cupboards, then lit a fire in the stove using the chopped wood stacked on the side porch. The heat filled the room slowly, mixing with the smell of burning pine and dried leaves that had snuck in on my boots. I didn't even unpack most of my clothes. I kept things simple. 1 book, a notepad, a flashlight, and a folding knife I always kept when I went outdoors. I wasn't expecting to need it for anything serious, just for peace of mind. The first night was peaceful. I made some pasta, watched the fire for a while, then went to bed early. I slept deeply, better than I had in months. In the morning, I woke with light pouring through the windows. There was a thin layer of frost on the grass outside, and I could see my breath when I stepped onto the porch with a mug of instant coffee in hand. The silence was unbelievable. No cars, no voices, no humming fridges or rumbling subway cars. Just birds and the distant creak of trees shifting in the wind. I spent that first day hiking around the trails that wrapped around the back of the property. The cabin sat on about 15 acres of forest, most of it left untouched. There were some markers on trees, red tape here and there, probably from past hunters or someone marking property lines. I followed them for a while, taking pictures with my phone even though I knew I couldn't upload them anywhere. There were no signs of other people, just tracks of deer, a few squirrels, and something that might have been a raccoon. That night, I ate dinner by lantern light. The quiet had shifted from peaceful to heavy. It wasn't bad, just thick. You don't realize how much noise surrounds you until it's gone. Even my own breathing seemed loud. When the wind moved through the trees, it made the walls of the cabin creak a little. Normal stuff, I knew that. Still, it made me glance up now and then, checking the windows. The third night is when things started to feel off. I had just gotten into bed. I kept the lantern on low and read a few chapters from my book. The stove still glowed red and orange. Just as I was drifting off, I heard something outside. It wasn't the wind or the usual snapping of branches. It was steady, a crunching, dragging noise, like someone walking through leaves slowly, then stopping, then moving again. I sat up and listened. The noise came from behind the cabin, near the woods. I told myself it was a deer or maybe even a bear. I'd seen signs warning to keep trash inside to avoid animals. But there was no trash. Everything was sealed. I hadn't left anything outside. And bears don't move like that. Not slow, not stopping every few feet. I got out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and stood by the window. I waited, aiming the light into the trees. Nothing, just shifting shadows and the breath of wind in the trees. After a while, I crawled back into bed and stayed there, eyes open, waiting for another sound. Nothing else came. I eventually fell asleep again. In the morning, I went out to check. I walked behind the cabin, scanning the soft ground. There were leaves everywhere, but under some of them, I noticed a few disturbed patches. Slight impressions. Not prints exactly, just areas where the leaves had been brushed aside or stepped on. They didn't look like animal tracks. They weren't deep enough, and they weren't shaped like hooves or paws, just flattened spots. I kept telling myself I was imagining it. I spent most of that day close to the cabin. I cooked, wrote in the notebook, gathered kindling, but I couldn't stop thinking about the sound. That night, I didn't light the lantern. I sat in the dark, near the window, watching. I stayed like that for hours. Around midnight, I saw movement. Just a flicker, a shape between the trees. No flashlight, no sound. Just something standing still, maybe 30 feet back from the edge of the clearing. Couldn't make out details. It was too dark, but it was tall, upright. Not a deer, not an animal, and it didn't move like one. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. After a minute, the shape stepped back into the trees and disappeared. No sound. Nothing, just gone. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even lie down. In the morning, I debated packing up and leaving early. But I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe someone wandered onto the land. I should have felt better thinking that, but I didn't. Because hunters wear orange, they carry lights. They don't stand still in the woods at midnight without making a sound. I stayed near the cabin again that day, kept the fire going. Made coffee even though my stomach felt tight and sour. I left the flashlight beside my bed. That night, I moved the small table in front of the door. It wouldn't stop anyone, but it made me feel like I was doing something. The next night, things escalated. It was just after 2 a.m. I hadn't slept. I kept the flashlight in my hand, sitting on the edge of the bed with my boots on. Then I heard it. Slow footsteps, crunching through the leaves, closer than before. This time, they stopped just outside the window over the sink. I didn't move, didn't even blink. I just sat there, heart pounding so hard I felt sick. Then a soft scraping, fingernails maybe, or something hard dragged slowly across the glass. I raised the flashlight and pointed it toward the window. Nothing. The light bounced off the glass and lit up the inside of the cabin more than outside. I turned it off again. The scraping came once more, then silence. I waited. I counted to 500 in my head. Then I counted again. Still nothing. I sat there until sunrise, then went outside with the knife in my hand. I checked the window. There were marks on the glass. Not deep, but real, like someone had dragged a piece of metal or bone against it. For parallel lines, uneven, not random. That was it. I packed everything into my bag, stuffed what I could into the car, and got ready to leave. But the car wouldn't start. The battery clicked once, then nothing. I popped the hood and tried again. Nothing. It wasn't dead when I parked it. It was fine when I drove in. The doors were locked. No sign of tampering. I went back inside. I kept the door locked, all the windows shut. I stayed up again, lantern lit. Just past midnight, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, this time circling the cabin. I didn't dare look. I just sat there, back against the wall, knife in hand. The steps circled twice. Then silence. I don't know how I slept, but I did. When I woke, it was bright outside. I ran to the car again. Still nothing. I opened the trunk, looked for anything useful. There was a roadside emergency kit, flares, jumper cables, and a small hatchet. I took all of it back into the cabin. That day was the longest of my life. I didn't eat. I drank a bottle of water slowly, trying not to move much. I stayed in the cabin, heart racing at every sound. I didn't know if whoever it was would try to get inside. I didn't know if they'd just been watching, or if they had worse intentions. But I knew one thing for sure. Someone was out there. Just before sunset, I made a plan. I grabbed one of the flares from the kit. I waited for darkness. When I heard the footsteps again, I stayed quiet. I was 33 the first time I stayed alone in a cabin. It was early November of 2016, and I'd just taken a 2-week unpaid leave from my job in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I worked IT support at a mid-sized firm, and between the constant noise of phones, hum of servers, and bad fluorescent lighting, I'd been feeling worn down. I needed quiet, real quiet. No neighbors, no cars, no emails, no phones. Just air, trees, and silence. A guy I used to work with had mentioned a small place near Cherry Springs State Park. He'd gone with his girlfriend a few years back and said it was secluded, old, but decent enough if you liked being alone. He sent me the name of the woman who handled the place. Some private owner, not a business. I emailed her. She responded quickly, and I wired a deposit. She gave me a key code for the lockbox and said to text her when I arrived. I didn't text her. I didn't want anyone knowing where I was. Not even her. That was the point. The drive took 4 hours. The last 30 miles were mostly winding mountain roads, surrounded by trees still clinging to the last rust-colored leaves of fall. The GPS gave up halfway through, but I had printed directions. I made the last turn onto a gravel path flanked by forest, and followed it until I reached a clearing. There it was. The cabin looked like it had been built in the 70s. It was small, maybe 25 by 25 feet. Dark brown siding, sagging porch, one metal chimney poking out of the roof. There was a little woodshed nearby, and behind that, the tree line thickened quickly. No other houses in sight. The air was cold and sharp. I turned off the car, stepped out, and stretched my legs. All I heard was wind and leaves. I took my bags inside. The inside smelled like cedar and dust. The living space had a small fireplace, 2 armchairs, and a table pushed against a window. A kitchenette sat along one wall. There was 1 bedroom and 1 bathroom. Everything looked clean but old. No internet, no cell service. There was a landline on the wall, but I didn't plan on using it. I unpacked my groceries. Mostly canned stuff, pasta, jerky, bread, and water, and then walked the perimeter once, checking the back and sides. Nothing unusual, just trees, endless and quiet. The first 2 days were uneventful. I read, wrote a bit in a notebook, and went on walks down the trail that started behind the cabin. It was overgrown and probably hadn't been cleared in a long time, but I liked how quiet it was. The only sounds were my boots crunching leaves, the occasional squirrel, and birds. I never saw another person. I slept well the first night. The second night, I thought I heard something just after midnight. It sounded like crunching, like someone stepping on dry leaves not far from the porch. I sat up in bed and listened. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. Could have been a deer, I figured. I'd seen a few in the area during the day. Still, I made sure the front and back doors were locked before going back to sleep. On the third day, I walked further along the trail than before. I brought a small backpack with snacks and a flashlight. After maybe 90 minutes, I reached a break in the trees and saw what looked like an old collapsed hunting blind about 50 yards off the path. I went to check it out. It was rotted, caved in, and half covered in moss. There were a few rusted cans and what looked like a busted folding chair. Nothing useful. I took a photo on my old Nikon and kept walking for another 20 minutes before heading back. That evening, I built a fire in the fireplace. The air was colder now, dipping below freezing at night. The cabin creaked more when it was cold. Old wood does that. I was used to it by now. At around 11 p.m., I was in bed reading by lantern light when I heard something again. This time, it was different. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the porch. It was slow and deliberate, and it lasted longer than the footsteps from the other night. I turned off the lantern and sat still, my ears strained in the dark. Then it stopped. Dead silence. I waited another 15 minutes, then got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight. I moved slowly to the front window and pulled back the curtain just an inch. The porch was empty. No movement, no shadows. I checked the lock again. Still engaged. I left the flashlight on the nightstand and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I walked out onto the porch to check for tracks. The frost had settled overnight, and the thin layer of white should have picked up anything. But there was nothing. No prints. No marks. I knelt down and looked closer. Still nothing. That's when I noticed something off in the tree line. Something pale, maybe 20 feet past the edge. I walked closer. It was a strip of white cloth, hanging from a branch about shoulder height. Looked like torn t-shirt fabric, frayed at the edges. I scanned the area, but didn't see anything else. I brought the cloth back to the cabin and left it on the porch rail. Probably some hiker lost part of their shirt, but it bothered me more than it should have. That afternoon, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't go back on the trail. I read more, made some pasta, and chopped a few logs from the stack beside the woodshed. As the sun dropped, I got a feeling I hadn't had since I was a kid, like being watched. I tried to shake it off. That night, I stayed up later than usual. I sat in the armchair with the flashlight and watched the window. Around 1:30 a.m., there was a faint creaking from the porch. It sounded like weight shifting on the boards. I didn't move, just held my breath and listened. Then came the dragging again. Slow, steady, right across the wood. I flicked the flashlight on and aimed it toward the door, even though it couldn't reach past the window. The sound stopped again. I waited. Still nothing. I didn't go outside this time. I stayed put until sunrise. On day 5, I noticed something weird with the firewood. The top layer of logs on the stack had been shifted. Not in a big way, just enough to notice, like someone had grabbed one and put it back in the wrong place. I hadn't touched that stack since the day before, and I was certain of it. I walked around the woodshed. No footprints, but the dirt was packed hard, and with the frost melting in the morning sun, it might not have shown anything even if there were. I opened the shed door and checked inside. Just more firewood, an old axe, a few empty jugs. Nothing strange. That night it was colder. The wind picked up and scraped tree branches against the roof. I kept the fire going until nearly 1 a.m., then let it die down and went to bed. Around 3, I woke up to a sound like metal hitting wood, just one sharp clank. It sounded like it came from behind the cabin. I got up and went to the back window. My flashlight swept the trees but caught nothing. I scanned the yard. The woodshed door was open. I knew I'd closed it earlier. I threw on boots and a coat, grabbed a crowbar I'd brought for splitting wood, and went out back. The shed door creaked in the wind. Inside, the axe was gone. I searched the ground around the shed again. Still no prints. I closed the door and went back inside. I didn't sleep after that. The next day, I packed some things. Not everything, but enough to leave fast if I needed to. I kept the car keys in my pocket. Around noon, I decided to check the trail again. I hadn't gone past the old blind since day 3. Maybe I'd find something that explained this. I wasn't thinking clearly at this point. I know that now, but at the time I needed answers. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no rustling. Just wind. I made it to the old blind and past it. After maybe 15 minutes, I saw a clearing I hadn't noticed before. At the far edge was a small circle of rocks, like a makeshift fire pit. Around it were bones. Small ones, maybe from rabbits or squirrels. Some blackened like they'd been burned. Then I saw the shirt. It was hanging from a branch just beyond the pit. Torn, stained. It looked like the same fabric I'd found before. I backed away slowly, turned around, and walked fast back to the cabin. When I got there, the door was open. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I stepped inside with the crowbar raised. The interior looked untouched at first, but then I noticed the flashlight on the nightstand was gone. The contents of my backpack were scattered on the floor. Some of my food was missing. My extra jacket was gone too. I backed out, locked the door, and went to the car. It wouldn't start. The battery was fine. I hadn't left the lights on. The starter just clicked but wouldn't turn over. I tried 3 times, then stopped. I was sweating despite the cold. I sat in the driver's seat trying to think. I had one option, the landline. I hadn't wanted to use it, but now I had no choice. I went back in and picked it up. No dial tone. It was dead. That's when I knew someone had been in the cabin while I was gone, and they'd cut the line. I checked the locks again, then pulled the curtains on every window. I stacked furniture against the door and kept the crowbar. I was 32 when I decided to rent a remote cabin in Southern Oregon for a week. I had just come off a long stretch of overtime hours at the job, barely sleeping and constantly behind a screen. I needed air, quiet, space. I didn't want to see another person for days. I booked the cabin online. It wasn't a resort or some glammed-up rental. It was a real backwoods cabin. The pictures showed an old wooden place tucked deep in the forest near the Siskiyou Mountains. The nearest town, Granton, was almost an hour away. No Wi-Fi, no cell reception, no paved roads once you got near it. That's exactly what I wanted. I left early in the morning in my truck, packed with food, water, a camping stove just in case, and some basic tools. I had everything from batteries to duct tape. I'd learned to prepare for anything when heading into the woods. It was late September, so the air was crisp, and the leaves had just started to change color. The drive was beautiful. Once I left the main highway, it was all dirt roads and trees. The directions from the owner were clear, even though the GPS dropped out about 20 miles from the place. I followed a narrow trail of rutted road, bouncing over roots and rocks, until I reached a small clearing. The cabin sat right in the middle of it. It was older than I expected. Real logs, not the fake kind you see in newer rentals. The roof had moss on it. The front porch creaked under my boots. The door stuck a little when I opened it. Inside, it was bare bones but clean. A wood stove, a small kitchen area with a propane tank, an old table and 2 chairs, a bed against the wall, and a small bathroom with a compost toilet. No shower, just a basin and water containers. No electricity except for a few solar-powered lanterns and a crank radio. I unpacked quickly, checked the place for mice or damage, but everything seemed in decent shape. The first night was peaceful. I made some soup on the stove, read a book by lantern light, then went to bed early. I didn't realize how badly I needed rest until my head hit the pillow. I slept nearly 12 hours. The next morning, I made coffee and sat on the porch, looking out at the trees. The clearing was small, maybe 30 yards wide and surrounded by thick forest. Tall pines, dry leaves crunching underfoot, and the faint smell of earth and sap. The air was completely still. No wind, no birdsong, just silence. I figured that was normal for the time of year. I went for a short hike that day, just exploring the area. I stayed close to the cabin since I didn't want to get lost. I marked trees with orange tape as I walked and checked my compass regularly. The terrain was uneven but beautiful. A lot of rocks, dry stream beds, and fallen logs. I didn't see a single person or hear anything man-made. That kind of quiet is rare. By the time I got back, it was late afternoon. I made a simple dinner, sat on the porch again, then went inside when the air got too cold. I noticed something strange as I was locking the front door for the night. One of the orange tape markers I'd used earlier was tied to a tree right near the edge of the clearing, not far from the porch. I hadn't put one there. I was sure of it. I'd gone the other way on my hike. I walked over to it, trying to recall if I'd looped around and forgotten. But the tape looked new, untouched by wind or sun. It was tied lower than I usually tied mine. I tend to loop them about eye level. This was waist high. I pulled it off and tossed it into my pocket. Maybe someone had been out here before me and left it, but it felt too fresh. That night I had trouble sleeping. The silence had turned from calming to heavy, like the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Around midnight, I thought I heard something move outside, twigs snapping. I lay still, listening. Nothing after that, just my own heartbeat. It was probably an animal. There were deer in the area, maybe even elk. I eventually dozed off again. The next day, I stuck closer to the cabin. I chopped some wood for the stove and organized my food. Around noon, I found another piece of orange tape tied to a tree behind the cabin. This one was even lower, almost at ankle height. I hadn't hiked that side at all. My stomach knotted up. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, slow and steady. Found 2 more pieces of tape on opposite ends, all tied low, all looking recently placed. I stood there for a while, just listening. The forest stayed still, watching. I considered packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe a forest worker had been by months ago. Maybe the wind carried some old tape from a previous visitor. I tried to rationalize it, but I still didn't sleep well that night. On the 4th day, I woke up to find boot prints in the dirt just behind the cabin. My boots were in the cabin overnight. These were different, wider, heavier. The prints went from the woods up to the back wall and then disappeared. No return prints. It had rained lightly the night before, just enough to soften the soil. The prints were fresh. I walked in circles, trying to figure out the direction they'd come from. They led in, but not back out. That's when I realized something wasn't right. I got out my hunting knife and kept it on me the rest of the day. I took inventory of everything. Nothing was missing, but I noticed that one of the woodpile stacks had been shifted, like someone had leaned against it or maybe looked through it. I had stacked it neatly. Now it was uneven. I stayed inside most of that day, checking the windows, listening. Every little creak in the cabin made me jump. I didn't light the lanterns that night. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I sat in the dark with my knife, barely moving. Around 3 in the morning, I heard movement outside. Slow, deliberate steps. They crunched the leaves, circled the cabin, paused at the porch, then faded back into the trees. I didn't sleep at all after that. I made my decision early the next morning. I was leaving. I didn't care if I lost the last few days of my rental. I packed everything fast. As I loaded the truck, I noticed something under the porch. Piece of tarp, half buried. I got down to look. It was a bundle of stuff. Empty cans, a stained blanket, a torn backpack. Someone had been living under there, or hiding. I drove out fast, bouncing over the road. Every branch looked like a figure. Every rustle made me flinch. Once I had cell service again, I stopped and called the sheriff's department in Granton. I reported what I'd found, the prints, the tarp, the tape. The deputy I spoke to said they'd send someone to check it out. but didn't sound surprised. I asked if this had happened before. He just said people come and go through those woods all the time. I drove all the way back to Portland that night. When I got home, I locked every door and window, then sat on the couch until sunrise, still holding the knife. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the sheriff's department. The deputy said they'd found evidence of someone squatting near the cabin. A small camp in the woods about 300 yards out. Blankets, cans, some stolen tools, and a journal. No sign of the person. They were gone. Probably still in the forest somewhere, maybe moved on. They couldn't find fingerprints or anything they could track. I asked if the cabin owner knew. He said they had called him, but there wasn't much he could do either. It wasn't illegal to be in the forest. Not until someone got hurt. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not just the person hiding out there, but the way they moved. The boot prints that didn't lead away. The tape, the sounds. They weren't trying to hurt me, not directly, but they were watching. They were close enough to leave signs, sneak up, stand under the porch. I sold my camping gear a month later. I haven't gone into the woods since. I still love the idea of the wild, the silence, the space. But now I understand what's out there isn't always animals or wind. Sometimes it's people. People who don't want to be found. People who watch from the trees. People who live just outside the firelight. And they know when you're alone.